The train whistled its arrival into Cottonwood Springs, sending a plume of steam billowing across the wooden platform. Margaret Blackwood clutched her small valise tighter, feeling the weight of her 38 years in the ache of her back. After 3 days of hard travel, the Montana Territory stretched before her, wild and unforgiving as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street. She smoothed her best traveling dress, navy blue wool that had seen better days, and touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's final gift. This far-flung frontier town represented her last chance, her final hope after the telegram that had shattered what little remained of her dignity. Seeking younger bride. Agreement terminated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Last call for Cottonwood Springs, the conductor shouted, eyeing Margaret with impatience. End of the line, ma'am. Yes, thank you, Margaret replied, gathering her courage along with her skirts as she descended onto the weathered platform. The journey from Boston had depleted nearly all her savings, but Joshua Kent's advertisement had seemed like Providence itself. Established rancher seeks educated, practical woman as wife. Must appreciate books and not fear hard work. His letters had been thoughtful, even poetic at times. They'd corresponded for months before he'd sent train fare. Not once had he asked her age. The station master, a man with a silver moustache that drooped at the corners like a weeping willow, approached her with curious eyes. You must be Mr. Kent's mail-order bride, he said, not unkindly. Been expecting you since Tuesday. Margaret offered a tight smile. There were delays in Chicago. Is Mr. Kent here to meet me? The station master's expression shifted just slightly, but enough that Margaret felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Mr. Kent was by earlier, said to tell you there's been he cleared his throat, a change of circumstances. Said you should check in at the Miller boarding house for the night. The words struck her like a physical blow. I see, she managed, though her throat had gone dry as prairie dust. And where might I find this boarding house? 2 blocks down. Ma'am, can't miss it. White house with blue shutters. He hesitated. I can carry your bag if that won't be necessary, Margaret interrupted, straightening her spine. I've managed this far on my own. The main street of Cottonwood Springs revealed itself as she walked. A general store, a saloon with piano, music spilling through its swinging doors, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a collection of buildings that comprise the heart of this frontier town. Men stopped their conversations to watch her pass, their curious gazes making her cheeks flush. She kept her eyes forward, determined not to reveal the humiliation burning within her. The Miller boarding house was indeed impossible to miss, its freshly painted shutters a splash of sky blue against weathered white clapboard. A woman in her 50s, iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, answered Margaret's knock. Mrs. Miller, I presume? Margaret asked. I was told you might have a room available. The woman's eyes narrowed with recognition. You're Kent's bride. It wasn't a question. Come in before you catch your death. Autumn comes early to these mountains. The boarding-house parlor was clean but sparse, furnished with mismatched chairs and a braided rug worn thin in the center. Mrs. Miller gestured for Margaret to sit. I'll prepare some tea, she said. You look like you could use it. Margaret sank onto the chair, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. Has everyone in town been discussing my arrival? Mrs. Miller paused in the doorway to the kitchen. It's a small town, Miss Blackwood, Margaret Blackwood. Miss Blackwood in Cottonwood Springs. A new face is news, especially a woman traveling alone. She disappeared into the kitchen, returning minutes later with a tray bearing a chipped teapot and 2 cups. Joshua Kent is well regarded here. His ranch is one of the most prosperous in the valley. Margaret accepted the cup with trembling hands. Yet he couldn't be troubled to meet his intended bride at the station. Mrs. Miller's mouth tightened as she poured her own tea. Men out here can be particular. Many want young girls who can bear a dozen children and won't question their ways. She studied Margaret over the rim of her cup. You're not what he expected. You mean I'm too old? Margaret said flatly. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she'd faced the truth before boarding the train in Boston. At 38, she was considered firmly on the shelf, yet Joshua's letters had given her hope. He'd valued her thoughts on literature, her experience as a school teacher, her practical knowledge of household management. His wife died in childbirth 2 years ago, Mrs. Miller said, setting down her cup. Both she and the baby. She was barely 20. I see. No, I don't think you do, Mrs. Miller replied, leaning forward slightly. Joshua's been raising his daughter alone. She's 6 now, wild as a spring creek and twice as headstrong. What that child needs isn't a mother young enough to give her siblings. She needs guidance from someone who understands the world. Margaret stared into her tea, watching the leaves swirl. Mr. Kent clearly disagrees. Mrs. Miller's laugh was short and sharp. Joshua Kent is a good man, but stubborn as an old mule. He's gotten some notion in his head about starting fresh with a young bride, too proud to admit what he really needs. She rose suddenly. Let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted. The small bedroom under the eaves was clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand beneath a square window that looked out over the mountains. The last light of day painted the distant peaks in shades of purple and gold. Thank you, Margaret said, setting her valise on the bed. What do I owe you for the night? Mrs. Miller waved away the question. We'll settle accounts in the morning. Rest now. Things often look different after a night's sleep. Left alone, Margaret unpacked her nightgown and the book she'd been reading on the train, Emerson's essays, the pages dog-eared and marked with her notes. She'd imagined reading aloud by lamplight in a cozy ranch house, sharing passages with a husband who appreciated literature as much as she did. Foolish dreams from a woman who should have known better. She was almost asleep when a commotion downstairs jolted her awake. Heavy footsteps, a man's voice raised in argument, Mrs. Miller's firm responses. Margaret sat up, straining to hear. You can't just leave her stranded, Joshua Kent. She's come all this way. She's come all this way. I sent a telegram weeks ago breaking it off. The man's voice was deep, resonant even in anger, which apparently arrived after she'd already left Boston, Mrs. Miller shot back. What kind of man leaves a woman with nowhere to go in a strange town? I'll pay her fare back east. She can leave on tomorrow's train. Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation. She slipped from bed and pressed her ear to the door. And what's she supposed to do when she gets there? Mrs. Miller demanded. She likely sold everything to come here, used all her savings. A heavy sigh, then. What would you have me do, Ida? I need a young wife, someone who can help with the ranch for decades to come, not what? A woman with experience and wisdom. Lord help me, Joshua. I thought you had more sense. You haven't even seen her, he countered, and neither have you. Mrs. Miller's voice rose. You took one look at that silver in her hair from the station window and turned tail like a coward. Silence fell. Margaret leaned against the door, her heart pounding painfully. She hadn't realized her hair had begun to silver. In Boston, she'd still been considered handsome, if not young. I'll speak with her in the morning, the man, Joshua, finally said, his voice subdued. I'll explain and make arrangements. It's the decent thing to do. Decent would have been meeting her at the station, like you promised, Mrs. Miller muttered. Heavy footsteps crossed the parlor, followed by the sound of the front door opening and closing. Margaret crept back to bed, her mind churning. Tomorrow, she would face Joshua Kent with all the dignity she could muster. She would not beg to be accepted, would not plead her case like some desperate spinster. If he wanted to pay her fare back, east, so be it. But as she stared at the darkening sky through the small window, Margaret faced a hard truth. There was nothing left for her in Boston. No teaching position, no family home, no prospects. She had bet everything on this new beginning. Sleep claimed her eventually, but her dreams were uneasy, filled with train whistles and disapproving faces, with letters that turned to ashes in her hands. Morning arrived with pale sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. Margaret dressed with care in her second-best dress, a dove grey with subtle pleating at the bodice, and pinned her hair in a modest arrangement that nonetheless attempted to minimize the silver strands at her temples. Mrs. Miller was frying potatoes when Margaret descended the stairs, and a young girl sat at the kitchen table, legs swinging as she concentrated on a slate where she was practicing her letters. "Good morning," Margaret said, pausing in the doorway. The child looked up, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm, grey-blue and penetrating. "You talk funny," the girl said bluntly. "Are you from back east?" "Pa says people from back east. I talk like they've got clothespins on their noses." "Lily Kent," Mrs. Miller scolded, turning from the stove. "Mind your manners. This is Miss Blackwood." The girl, Lily, studied Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Are you the lady who was supposed to marry my pa?" Margaret's breath caught. Before she could formulate a response, the back door swung open, and a tall man in a worn canvas coat stepped into the kitchen. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun. Dark hair, shot through with the first threads of silver at the temples, curled slightly where it met his collar. Joshua Kent stopped short when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kent," Margaret said, inclining her head slightly, determined to maintain her composure despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I believe we had an appointment at the train station yesterday." He had the grace to look uncomfortable, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed habitual rather than considered. "Miss Blackwood, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Is that what we're calling it?" Mrs. Miller muttered, turning back to her potatoes. "Sit down, both of you. Breakfast is nearly ready, and I won't have good food going cold while you two dance around each other." Margaret should have been offended at being ordered about like a child, but there was something refreshing about Mrs. Miller's directness after the stifling politeness of Boston society. She took a seat across from Lily, who continued to stare at her with unabashed interest. Joshua sat beside his daughter, placing his hat on the empty chair. Up close, Margaret could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the slight shadow of beard on his jaw. He looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. "Your letters didn't mention your age," he said finally, the words awkward and blunt. "Neither did yours," Margaret replied evenly, "though I didn't think to ask. The content of your character seemed more relevant than the date of your birth." Mrs. Miller made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh as she placed heaping plates before them. "Can you read, Miss Blackwood?" Lily asked suddenly. "Mrs. Miller's teaching me my letters, but she says I need more discipline." The child struggled with the word. "I was a school teacher in Boston for 15 years, Margaret answered, grateful for the interruption. "Reading is one of life's greatest pleasures." Lily's eyes widened. "Pa likes reading too. He reads to me every night, even when he's tired from the ranch." Joshua cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood won't be staying with us, Lily. She'll be heading back east on today's train." "Why?" The child frowned. "We've got plenty of room, and Ma's old books are just collecting dust since Pa's too busy to read them anymore." A shadow crossed Joshua's face at the mention of his late wife. "It's complicated, Lily girl." "It doesn't seem complicated," Margaret said quietly. "You advertised for a bride." I answered, "You've now decided I'm unsuitable. There's nothing complicated about disappointment, Mr. Kent. It's a rather straightforward emotion." Lily looked between them, her brow furrowed in confusion. Mrs. Miller sat down with her own plate, watching the exchange with sharp eyes. "I need a wife who can help with the ranch for years to come," Joshua said stiffly. "Someone who can Bear. Children? Margaret finished when he faltered. Yes, Mrs. Miller made your requirements quite clear last night, though your advertisement mentioned education and appreciation for books, not fertility. Lily tugged at her father's sleeve. What's fertility, Pa? Joshua's face reddened. Nothing you need to worry about. Eat your breakfast. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Margaret forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. She was acutely aware of Joshua studying her when he thought she wouldn't notice. I'll make arrangements for your return journey, he said finally, pushing his half-eaten breakfast away, and compensate you for your trouble. I don't want your charity, Mr. Kent, Margaret replied, meeting his gaze directly. But I would appreciate a recommendation for employment in town. I don't intend to return east. The statement seemed to surprise him. Employment? Here in Cottonwood Springs? Yes, I have experience as a teacher, housekeeper, and bookkeeper. Surely some of those skills are needed even in a small frontier town. Mrs. Miller set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. As a matter of fact, the town council's been trying to establish a proper school for months. Currently, the children are taught by the preacher's wife 3 afternoons a week, and she's expecting her 4th child come spring. Joshua frowned. Miss Blackwood is a stranger here. The council wouldn't hire— They might, Mrs. Miller interrupted, if she came with a recommendation from a respected rancher. Her pointed look left no doubt as to which rancher she meant. Before Joshua could respond, the front door opened and a woman's voice called out, "Ida, are you home? In the kitchen, Clara?" Mrs. Miller replied. A moment later, a harried-looking woman appeared in the doorway, a toddler balanced on her hip and a piece of paper clutched in her free hand. The telegram office just opened. This came for Miss Blackwood yesterday evening. After Thomas closed up shop, she paused, taking in the tableau at the breakfast table. Oh, I'm interrupting. Not at all, Clara, Mrs. Miller said, rising to take the telegram. Thank you for bringing it over. The woman nodded, casting a curious glance at Margaret before retreating. Mrs. Miller handed the yellow paper to Margaret, who opened it with steady fingers, despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in her chest. The message was brief but devastating. The school position filled. Stop lodgings rented. Stop funds depleted by lawyer. Stop do not return. Stop sincere regrets. Stop Harriet. Stop Harriet. Margaret's fingers tightened on the telegram, the paper crinkling slightly as the words sank in. Her last connection to Boston, gone. Her safety net, vanished. Her friend Harriet had been managing her affairs while she traveled west, and now this news confirmed what Margaret had feared. There was truly nothing to return to. She folded the telegram with deliberate care and tucked it into her pocket, aware of 3 pairs of eyes watching her every move. Her throat constricted, but she wouldn't give Joshua Kent the satisfaction of seeing her distress. Bad news? Mrs. Miller asked softly. Nothing unexpected, Margaret replied, her voice impressively steady. It appears my bridges are quite thoroughly burned. She met Joshua's gaze across the table. It seems I have no choice but to find my place here in Cottonwood Springs, with or without your assistance, Mr. Kent. Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or simply surprise at her composure. He opened his mouth to respond when the back door burst open again. Josh! A man in a sheepskin coat stumbled in, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. It's the Jenkins boy, fell from the hayloft at their place. Doc Sanders is away in Helena. They need help now. Joshua was on his feet instantly. How bad? Arms broken for sure. Maybe worse. He hit his head on the way down. Miss Blackwood was a nurse during the war. Lily piped up, and all eyes turned to the child in surprise. You said so in your letter, didn't you? Pa read it to me. Margaret's gaze snapped to Joshua, who had the grace to look abashed. I assisted the doctors at a field hospital in Washington. she clarified. "I'm not formally trained, but I've set bones before." A moment of calculation crossed Joshua's face, then, decisively, "Come with us. The Jenkins place is only a mile." Out without waiting for her response, he grabbed his hat and headed for the door. Margaret hesitated only briefly before rising. "Mrs. Miller, might I borrow an apron?" Minutes later, she was climbing into Joshua's wagon, a borrowed apron folded over her arm. Lily scrambled up beside her before Joshua could object. "Lily girl, you should stay with Mrs. Miller," he began. "I want to help," the child insisted, her jaw set in a stubborn line that matched her father's. "I can hold things for Miss Blackwood." Margaret intervened before an argument could brew. Having small, nimble hands is often useful in these situations. "Mr. Kent, if you have no objection." He sighed but nodded, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. They rode in tense silence, the wagon jolting over the rutted dirt road that led out of town. Fields of golden wheat stretched to the distant mountains, the late morning sun warming the air despite the autumn chill. "The Jenkins family arrived last spring," Joshua explained as they rode. "Father, mother, 3 boys. They're sharecropping a piece of my land until they can afford their own." "How old is the injured boy?" Margaret asked. "Tommy's 7, bright kid, always climbing where he shouldn't." They crested a small rise, and a modest cabin came into view. A woman paced anxiously in the yard, clutching a baby to her chest. She ran toward the wagon as it approached. "Mr. Kent, thank the Lord." She spotted Margaret. "Who's this?" "Miss Blackwood has medical experience," Joshua said, helping Margaret down from the wagon. "Where's Tommy?" "Inside. Jacob's with him." The woman, Mrs. Jenkins, led them toward the cabin, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's in an awful state, screaming something terrible until he went quiet. Now he won't wake up proper." The cabin's interior was dim after the bright morning light. A boy lay on a rough-hewn table, his face ashen. A man, presumably Mr. Jenkins, stood beside him, one hand resting on the boy's forehead. What immediately caught Margaret's attention was the unnatural angle of the child's left arm. "Has he been unconscious the entire time?" Margaret asked, slipping off her gloves and approaching the table. "No, ma'am," Mr. Jenkins answered. "He was awake and screaming at first. Passed out maybe 10 minutes ago." Margaret nodded, her teacher's demeanor falling away as she assessed the situation with clinical efficiency. "I need clean cloths, hot water and whiskey if you have it, both for sterilization and for the pain when he wakes." She turned to Joshua. "Mr. Kent, I'll need you to hold him still when we set the bone. Lily, come stand by his head. Talk to him softly. Even if he seems unconscious, a familiar voice can be comforting." To Margaret's surprise, no one questioned her authority. Mrs. Jenkins hurried to fetch the requested items, while Lily moved to the position indicated, already whispering soothing words to the unconscious boy. Margaret carefully examined the arm, her touch gentle but sure. "It's a clean break of the radius, the forearm bone. That's fortunate. No compound fracture." She pressed her fingers lightly along the boy's scalp. "There's a sizable lump here, which explains the unconsciousness. We'll need to monitor him closely after we set the arm." Joshua watched her with undisguised curiosity. "You seem experienced." 4 years assisting surgeons tends to do that," she replied, rolling up her sleeves. "I've seen far worse than this on men twice his size." When everything was prepared, Margaret positioned Joshua's hands on the boy's shoulder and wrist. "When I count to 3, I'll need you to pull steadily, not yank, while I guide the bone back into place." Joshua nodded, his expression grim but determined. 1, 2, 3. The bone made a sickening sound as it realigned. The boy's eyes flew open, and he let out a piercing scream. Margaret worked quickly, splinting the arm with pieces of kindling wrapped in clean cloth, then binding it securely. "There now, it's done," she soothed, as the boy's screams subsided to whimpers. "You're very brave, Tommy." Much braver than many soldiers I treated." The compliment seemed to penetrate the child's pain. He hiccuped and stared at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Really?" "Absolutely. Now let's have a sip of this tea Mrs. Jenkins has prepared, and then you can tell me all about how you came to be climbing in the hayloft when I suspect you were supposed to be doing chores." A ghost of a smile appeared on the boy's pale face. "Wasn't supposed to be up there. I thought as much." Margaret helped him sip the willow bark tea his mother had brewed. "Your arm will heal, but you'll need to be still and careful for several weeks. No more climbing until the doctor says it's safe." As she continued to tend to Tommy, Margaret was aware of the adults watching her, particularly Joshua, whose gaze she could feel like a physical presence. She finished by checking the boy's pupils and asking him simple questions to assess his mental state. "He should rest now," she told the anxious parents. "Wake him every few hours today and tonight. If he's difficult to rouse or complains of worsening headache, send for help immediately." "Thank you, miss," Mrs. Jenkins said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We don't have much, but whatever we can pay—" "There's no need," Margaret interrupted gently. "I'm glad I could help." Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its westward slide. Joshua helped Lily into the wagon, then turned to Margaret. "That was impressive." "It was necessary," she corrected, refusing to acknowledge the warmth his praise kindled. "Any decent person would have helped. Not any person could have done what you did." He hesitated, then added, "The town really does need a teacher. If you're serious about staying, I'll speak to the council." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret climbed into the wagon, adjusting her skirts with deliberate care. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Kent." The ride back to town unfolded in contemplative silence, broken only by Lily's occasional questions about setting bones and treating injuries. Margaret answered each query patiently, impressed by the child's quick mind and lack of squeamishness. "You're good with children," Joshua observed as they neared town. "I've taught hundreds over the years," Margaret replied. "Children are generally more honest and reasonable than adults, in my experience." The corner of his mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but close. "Lily hasn't stopped talking since you arrived. Usually takes her weeks to warm up to strangers." "That's because Miss Blackwood doesn't treat me like I'm stupid," Lily declared. "Most grown-ups do." Joshua winced. "I don't think you're stupid, Lily girl." "No, but you think I don't understand things." The child fixed him with a surprisingly penetrating gaze. "Like why you don't want Miss Blackwood to be my new ma." The wagon jerked to a halt, and Margaret felt heat climb her neck. "Lily, that's not appropriate." "It's because she's old," Lily continued matter-of-factly. "But Mrs. Miller says that's foolish because older people know more things, like how to fix broken arms and teach reading." Joshua cleared his throat, clearly mortified. "Lily, that's enough." "It's all right, Mr. Kent," Margaret said, finding unexpected humor in the situation. "Your daughter has merely articulated what everyone has been dancing around. I am indeed older than your ideal bride. Nothing to be gained by pretending otherwise." They had reached Mrs. Miller's boarding house. Joshua helped them down from the wagon, his movements stiff with discomfort. "Thank you for your assistance today, Miss Blackwood," he said formally. I'll speak to the council tomorrow about the teaching position." "Thank you." Margaret turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Kent, may I make an observation?" He looked wary but nodded. "Your daughter is exceptionally bright, but in need of consistent education and guidance. Whether or not I secure the teaching position, you would do well to prioritize those qualities in whoever becomes her stepmother. Youth fades. Wisdom, one hopes, only deepens." Without waiting for his response, she took Lily's hand and headed inside, where Mrs. Miller waited on the porch, curiosity evident in her expression. "Well?" the older woman prompted. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "I believe I've secured a recommendation for the teaching position." Mrs. Miller looked past her to where Joshua still stood beside his wagon, his expression thoughtful. "And something else too, if I'm not mistaken." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret chided, though she couldn't help glancing back. Joshua met her, gaze briefly before climbing into his wagon. "Mr. Kent has made his priorities quite clear." "Has he now?" Mrs. Miller's tone was knowing. "We'll see about that." The town council met the following evening in the back room of Cottonwood Springs' only hotel. Margaret spent the day preparing, reviewing her teaching credentials, and planning how to present herself. Mrs. Miller helped her press her best dress and even loaned her a cameo brooch to complement the one she already wore. "For luck," the landlady said, pinning it to Margaret's collar. "Though with your qualifications, you shouldn't need it." Margaret wasn't so confident. She'd encountered enough small-minded men in Boston to know that qualifications often mattered less than appearances and connections. And in this town, she had only one tenuous connection, a man who had rejected her within hours of her arrival. The council chamber, in reality the hotel's private dining room, was dominated by a long oak table where 5 men sat in varying attitudes of impatience. Margaret recognized the station master and the hotel's owner. The others were strangers, though one had the unmistakable look of a preacher. Joshua sat at the far end, his expression inscrutable. "Miss Blackwood," the apparent chairman greeted her, "I'm Mayor Thomas Holt. These are my colleagues on the town council." Brief introductions followed, confirming her guess about the preacher, Reverend Simmons, whose wife currently taught the town's children. The other 2 were Mr. Fredericks, who owned the general store, and Dr. Sanders, recently returned from Helena. "Mr. Kent tells us you're interested in the teaching position we've been considering," Mayor Holt continued. "You have experience?" 15 years at the Blackwood Academy for Girls in Boston," Margaret replied, remaining standing since no one had offered her a seat. "The school was founded by my father. I taught literature, mathematics, history, and natural sciences." The men exchanged glances, clearly impressed despite themselves. "And why did you leave this position?" Reverend Simmons asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected some scandal. "My father passed away last year. The school's debts forced its closure." The admission stung, but Margaret kept her voice steady. "I came west, seeking new opportunities." "As Joshua Kent's mail-order bride," the Reverend added pointedly. "Yet here you are, applying for employment instead." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Joshua shifted in his chair but said nothing. "My arrangement with Mr. Kent was not what either of us expected," Margaret replied diplomatically. "However, my circumstances don't diminish my qualifications." Dr. Sanders leaned forward. "I understand you assisted with the Jenkins boy yesterday." "Set his arm." "I did." "Set his arm." "I did." "Set his arm." "I examined him this morning. Clean break, expertly set." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Where did you learn such skills?" "I volunteered with the Sanitary Commission during the war," Margaret explained. 4 years in a field hospital outside Washington. This revelation seemed to impress them even more than her teaching credentials. Even the Reverend looked thoughtful. "The position pays $30 a month," Mayor Holt said. "Term runs September through May, with breaks for harvest and planting. We've allocated funds to convert the old claims office into a schoolhouse, but it needs considerable work." "I understand," Margaret nodded. "How many students?" 27 at last count, ages 5 to 16. "A challenging range," she acknowledged, "but not insurmountable with proper planning and structure." The questioning continued for nearly an hour. Margaret outlined her teaching philosophy, proposed curriculum, and disciplinary approach. Throughout it all, Joshua remained largely silent, speaking only when directly addressed. Finally, Mayor Holt cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood, would you mind stepping outside while we deliberate?" The hotel corridor was empty. Margaret paced its length, her thoughts in turmoil. The teaching position was her only realistic option for remaining in Cottonwood Springs. Without it, she faced an impossible choice: return east with Joshua's charity money, assuming he still offered it, or try to find work in one of the larger Montana settlements. Neither prospect appealed. Boston held nothing but memories of failure and loss, and starting over again in yet another strange town seemed beyond her strength. She'd invested so much hope in this journey west, emotionally as well as financially. The door opened, startling her from her thoughts. Joshua stood there, his expression unreadable. "They'd like you to come back in." Margaret steeled herself and followed him inside. The council members looked solemn, and her heart sank. "Miss Blackwood," Mayor Holt began, "we've reviewed your qualifications and discussed the town's needs. While you are undoubtedly well-educated and experienced—" "Here it comes," Margaret thought, bracing herself for rejection. "We have concerns about your living situation." This was not what she'd expected. "My living situation?" Reverend Simmons cleared his throat. "A single woman living alone in a frontier town invites gossip. Mrs. Miller's boarding house is respectable, but it's primarily for travelers, not permanent residents." "I see." Margaret's mind raced. "I would be happy to arrange more suitable accommodations once I'm established. Perhaps rooms above the schoolhouse itself." The men exchanged glances. "That might be acceptable," Mayor Holt said slowly. "But there's also the matter of your age." Margaret stiffened. "I wasn't aware teaching had an age limit." "It doesn't," Dr. Sanders interjected, "but life out here is harsh. Winter storms, spring floods, the occasional Indian trouble. A woman alone." "I survived 4 years of war," Margaret interrupted, an edge creeping into her voice. "I've treated men with limbs blown away by cannon fire. I've endured the loss of my family, my home, and my livelihood. I believe I can manage a Montana winter." Silence fell over the room. Margaret realized she had spoken more sharply than intended, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. If these men were going to deny her the position based on such flimsy pretexts, they should at least be honest about it. To her surprise, Joshua rose from his seat. "Gentlemen, if I may." He turned to face her. "Miss Blackwood, the council has voted to offer you the teaching position, contingent on one condition." Hope flared within her. "And that condition is—" "That you accept my hand in marriage." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "It solves all concerns," Mayor Holt explained eagerly. "Your living situation, your security, the propriety of a woman in your position." "Stop!" Margaret held up her hand, her mind reeling. "Are you suggesting that I must marry Mr. Kent to teach your children?" The men looked uncomfortable. "Not suggesting," Reverend Simmons clarified, "requiring for the good of the community." "This is preposterous," Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet. "My ability to teach has nothing to do with my marital status." "Perhaps not in Boston," the Reverend countered, "but here in Cottonwood Springs, we have different standards." Margaret turned to Joshua, who had the decency to look uncomfortable. "And you agreed to this arrangement?" His eyes met hers, surprisingly direct. "I proposed it." The admission struck her like a physical blow. Just yesterday, he'd been repulsed by the idea of marrying a woman her age. Now, he offered marriage as some kind of charitable solution to her employment dilemma. "Why?" she demanded. "Lily needs a mother. he said simply. The ranch needs a woman's touch, and you need a position that uses your considerable talents. He paused. It's a practical solution. Practical, she echoed, the word tasting bitter. How convenient that you've overcome your objection to my advanced age. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Yesterday, I saw you save a boy's life with skill and compassion that most trained doctors would envy. I watched my daughter respond to you in a way she hasn't to anyone since her mother died. Those qualities matter more than the number of years you've lived. His words should have been gratifying, but Margaret's pride balked at the coldly logical proposal. So this would be a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement, if you prefer to see it that way. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was tension in the set of his shoulders, a guardedness in his expression that suggested more complexity than his words conveyed. Mayor Holt cleared his throat. We'll give you time to consider the offer, Miss Blackwood. The teaching position remains open until you decide. Margaret nodded stiffly. Thank you, gentlemen. I'll need that time. She left the hotel with her thoughts in chaos, the evening air cool against her flushed cheeks. The sun had set, painting the western sky in bands of gold and crimson. Cottonwood Springs was settling in for the night, lamps being lit in windows, the saloon's piano music drifting down the street, horses being led to stables. This dusty, remote town could become her home. She could have purpose here, respect, perhaps even contentment. But at what cost to her dignity? Joshua Kent had rejected her as a bride, then offered marriage as a solution to her employment problems. The rational part of her understood the practicality of the arrangement. The wounded part of her pride couldn't bear the thought of being accepted out of convenience rather than desire. As she walked slowly back to Mrs. Miller's boarding house, Margaret realized she faced the most difficult decision of her life. One that would determine not just her future, but the kind of woman she would become in this harsh, beautiful frontier. I need a partner who brings wisdom to this household, who can help raise Lily to be the strong woman she deserves to become, who understands that life isn't always kind, but can be rich nonetheless. His eyes held hers. I believe that person is you, Margaret. She found herself deeply moved by his words, yet still hesitant. How can you be certain? You barely know me. I know enough, he said simply. I've seen your compassion with Tommy Jenkins, your patience with Lily, your dignity in the face of my inexcusable behavior. I've read your letters, thoughtful, intelligent missives that revealed a mind I'd be privileged to know better. He smiled faintly. I'm not offering undying passion, Margaret. I'm too old and too practical for such promises. Then what are you offering? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Respect, partnership, a home. He gestured to the ranch beyond the window. All this to share and build upon. The chance to make a difference in the lives of children who need education. A place where your knowledge and experience are valued, not dismissed because of silver in your hair. He paused. And the possibility that, with time, deeper feelings might grow. Margaret turned away, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. The library window framed a view of the ranch, the mountains beyond, the golden fields, the small figures of ranch hands tending cattle in the distance. It was beautiful. This place, wild and demanding and alive in a way Boston had never been. I need time, she said finally. This is not a decision to make hastily. Of course, if he was disappointed, he hid it well. The teaching position is yours regardless. I've made that clear to the council. My proposal stands separate from their offer. She turned back to him, surprised. You told them I could teach without marrying you? This morning, they weren't pleased, but they've agreed. He smiled wryly. Turns out even a small frontier town can't afford to turn away someone with your qualifications, especially when the alternative is the preacher's wife, who can barely manage her own brood, let alone a schoolroom full of others. Relief and gratitude washed through her. Thank you. That changes things considerably. I hoped it might. His eyes held hers. I want your decision, whatever it may be, to be made freely, not under duress. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lily's voice called out, "Pa, Mrs. Jenkins says dinner's ready, and Tommy wants to show Miss Blackwood how his arm is healing." Joshua's expression softened. "We'll be right there, Lily girl." To Margaret, he added, "I hope you'll stay for the meal. There's more of the ranch to see afterward if you're interested." "I'd like that," Margaret said, surprised to realize how much she meant it. Dinner was a lively affair in the large kitchen, with the Jenkins family joining them. The conversation flowed easily around topics of ranch life, the upcoming harvest festival, and the prospects for the new school. Margaret found herself drawn into discussions of curriculum and schedules, her opinions sought and valued. Throughout the meal, she observed Joshua, the way he listened attentively to Mrs. Jenkins' concerns about winter supplies, how he encouraged Tommy's animated description of his fall, despite having heard it before, the quiet authority he commanded without domineering. He was a good man, she decided. Flawed, certainly, but fundamentally decent. After the meal, while Mrs. Jenkins and her children tidied up, Joshua took Margaret to see the remainder of the ranch, the barn with its smell of hay and leather, the corral where several fine horses gazed at them with liquid eyes, the vegetable garden now mostly harvested, but still producing squash and late tomatoes. Claire started the garden, Joshua explained as they walked between the raised beds. She said every proper home needed fresh vegetables. I've maintained it as best I can, but it could use a woman's touch. It's lovely, Margaret said sincerely, and a practical necessity. Fresh produce is essential for good health, especially in winter. They paused at the garden's edge, looking back toward the house where lamplight now glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. It's almost time to head back to town, Joshua said reluctantly. I don't want to keep you out after dark. Yes, I should return. Margaret hesitated, then added, Thank you for today, for showing me all this, for clarifying matters. Have I? He asked, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. Clarified things. Somewhat. I still need time to think. He nodded, accepting this. Of course. As they walked back toward the house where the wagon was being prepared, Margaret gathered her courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. If I were to accept your proposal, would you expect, that is, would this be a marriage, in all senses of the word? Joshua stopped walking, his expression unreadable in the fading light. For a moment, Margaret feared she had crossed some line of propriety. I would expect a true marriage, he said finally, his voice low. Not immediately, perhaps. We would need time to grow comfortable with each other. But eventually, yes. He met her gaze directly. Is that a concern for you? I'm a spinster of 38, Margaret replied with painful honesty. I had assumed that certain aspects of marriage might not be expected at my age. To her surprise, a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Margaret, I'm 42, hardly a young man in my prime, but I'm not dead yet, and neither are you. The bluntness of his statement startled a laugh from her. No, I suppose we're not. Life out here is hard enough without denying ourselves its comforts and pleasures. His voice had softened. I would hope in time that we might find joy in all aspects of marriage, but I would never rush or pressure you. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but she appreciated his candor. Thank you for your honesty. Always, he promised. The ride back to town passed in companionable silence, Lily having fallen asleep against Margaret's side, exhausted from the day's excitement. The child's trust and warmth stirred something maternal in Margaret that she had thought long buried, not the desire for her own children, which she had accepted would never happen, but the deep, abiding love for a child who needed guidance. As they pulled up before Mrs. Miller's boarding house, Joshua gently lifted his sleeping daughter and carried her to the wagon's bench. He helped Margaret down, his hand warm and steady in hers. "How long do you need?" he asked quietly. "To decide." Margaret considered. "A week? I should see the schoolhouse, understand what needs to be done there, and I'd like to meet more of the townspeople, the parents of my potential students." He nodded, a sensible approach. There was admiration in his tone. "I'll have Mayor Holt show you the schoolhouse tomorrow, and perhaps you join us for Sunday services. Most of the town attends." "I'd like that." In the lantern light that spilled from the boarding house windows, his face was cast in warm shadows. The lines around his eyes softened. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed what he might have looked like as a younger man before grief and responsibility had marked him. "Good night, Margaret," he said softly. "Good night, Joshua." She watched the wagon pull away, her thoughts in turmoil. The day had transformed her understanding of Joshua Kent from a man who had rejected her to one who recognized his mistake and sought to correct it. Whether that was sufficient basis for marriage remained uncertain, but the possibility no longer seemed as outlandish as it had just hours ago. Mrs. Miller was waiting in the parlor, pretending to knit, though her curious gaze belied her casual posture. "Well, how was the Great Kent Ranch?" "Impressive," Margaret admitted, removing her bonnet and gloves. "Larger and more prosperous than I expected." "And its owner." Margaret sank into her usual chair by the fire. "More complex than I initially gave him credit for. Men usually are." Mrs. Miller set aside her knitting. "Has he improved his proposal?" "He's made it a true choice, not a condition of employment." Margaret explained the situation. "The teaching position is mine regardless of whether I accept his offer of marriage." Mrs. Miller's eyebrows rose. "Well, now, that does put things in a different light, gives you leverage." "It's not about leverage," Margaret objected. "It's about making a decision I can live with, not one forced upon me by circumstance." "And can you live with marrying Joshua Kent?" The question gave Margaret pause. Could she? A week ago she had been prepared to marry a stranger based on letters and practical considerations. Now that stranger had a face, a voice, a daughter who needed her. He had flaws, pride, stubbornness, a tendency to make decisions without consultation, but also undeniable virtues. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm considering it more seriously than I was this morning." Mrs. Miller smiled knowingly. "The ranch has a way of doing that to people. Something about seeing all a man has built with his own hands makes his proposal more appealing." "It's not just the ranch," Margaret said thoughtfully. "It's seeing him there, in his element, understanding why he is the way he is." She shook her head. "Is a week enough time to make such a momentous decision?" "Most marriages out here are decided on far less," Mrs. Miller pointed out. "At least you have his letters, a sense of his character. And now, knowledge of his home and circumstances. That's more than many women get, I suppose." Margaret sighed. "I've been given a chance few women in my position ever receive. A fresh start, meaningful work, the possibility of a family. Yet I hesitate. Because he wounded your pride, partly." She twisted her mother's cameo between her fingers. "And partly because I fear making another mistake. My judgment hasn't proven particularly sound of late." Mrs. Miller's expression softened. "Take your week, Margaret. See the school. Meet the townspeople. Spend more time with Lily and her father. Then make your decision based on the future you want, not the past you've endured." The next morning brought Mayor Holt to the boarding house, keys to the abandoned claims office in hand. The building was indeed in disrepair. dusty with cracked windows, broken floorboards, and walls in desperate need of whitewashing. But Margaret could see its potential. "The town council has allocated funds for repairs," Mayor Holt explained as they toured the space. "Whatever you need to make it suitable, we want our children to have proper schooling. It needs desks, bookshelves, a stove for winter," Margaret noted, already planning, "and those windows must be fixed before the cold sets in." "Consider it. You're done. Joshua Kent has offered his carpentry skills for whatever is needed." The mayor cleared his throat. "He mentioned that you're considering his proposal." Margaret kept her expression neutral. "I'm considering many things, Mayor Holt. My decision will be made when I'm ready, not before." The man had the grace to look abashed. "Of course, take all the time you need. The teaching position is yours regardless," as Joshua made quite clear. Over the following days, Margaret immersed herself in preparations for the school. She met with parents, assessed the educational levels of her future students, and worked alongside the men of the town as they repaired the schoolhouse. Word of her medical knowledge spread, and she found herself consulted on various minor ailments and injuries. She saw Joshua daily, sometimes at the schoolhouse where he worked on desks and bookshelves, sometimes at Mrs. Miller's where he and Lily took evening meals. Their interactions were cordial, even warm, but he never pressed her for an answer, respecting her need for time. On Sunday, she attended services at the small church, sitting beside Joshua and Lily as Reverend Simmons delivered a surprisingly eloquent sermon on new beginnings. Afterward, during the community gathering on the church lawn, Margaret was introduced to seemingly everyone in Cottonwood Springs. "You're a godsend, Miss Blackwood," Mrs. Thompson declared, her brood of 5 children circling around her like satellites. "My eldest can barely write his name, and he's 12. My Jenny loves books," another mother added. "Been reading the same 3 over and over, because that's all we have." "The Jenkins boy's arm is healing clean," Dr. Sanders remarked, joining the conversation. "That splint was expertly done. We could use your skills here, Miss Blackwood, and not just in the schoolroom." Throughout it all, Margaret was aware of Joshua watching her, not obtrusively, but with quiet appreciation as she navigated the social currents of his community. When they made their way back to Mrs. Miller's that afternoon, he walked beside her while Lily ran ahead. "You've made quite an impression," he observed. "The town's already adopted you as its own." "They're good people," Margaret replied. "Eager for education and advancement, despite the frontier conditions. They're hungry for civilization," Joshua agreed. "It's why I built the library in my home, why I encouraged the council to establish a proper school. The wilderness shapes us, but it needn't make us savage." His words resonated with Margaret's own philosophy. That's exactly right. Education is what distinguishes a settlement from mere survival. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. "Tomorrow is your deadline," Joshua said finally. "Have you reached a decision?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I have." His stride faltered slightly, but he didn't press. "Will you tell me now, or would you prefer more privacy?" "Privacy, I think." She glanced ahead to where Lily was attempting to balance on a fence rail, "and I'd like Lily to be present. What I have to say concerns her as well." Joshua nodded, his expression betraying nothing. "We'll come for you at noon then, take you to the ranch." As they reached the boarding house, he hesitated, then added softly, "Whatever your decision, Margaret, know that you have my deepest respect. This past week has only confirmed what your letters suggested. You are a remarkable woman." That evening, Margaret sat by her window long after darkness had fallen, contemplating the decision she had made. It wasn't the choice she had expected when she boarded the train in Boston, nor even the one she might have made a week ago. But it was, she believed, the right one for the woman she had become through loss and journey and new understanding. When, Sleep finally claimed her. It was deep and dreamless, the rest of a mind at peace with its conclusions. Morning dawned clear and cool, the mountains sharp against a sky of impossible blue. Margaret dressed with care in her best dress, the deep burgundy wool that brought out the warmth in her complexion and minimized the silver in her dark hair. She fastened both cameo brooches at her throat, her mother's and Mrs. Miller's loaned piece, and pinned her hair in a style that was elegant without being ostentatious. "You look like a woman who knows her own mind," Mrs. Miller observed as Margaret descended the stairs at 11:30. "I am," Margaret confirmed. "Want to tell me your decision before they arrive?" Margaret smiled. "You'll know soon enough." Precisely at noon, the now familiar wagon rolled up outside. Joshua helped Lily down, then approached the boarding house. He had dressed formally as well, a proper suit coat over his usual vest, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed close. "Margaret," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "You look lovely." "Thank you." She turned to Mrs. Miller. "We shouldn't be long." "Take all the time you need," the landlady replied with a knowing smile. "I'll keep supper warm." The ride to the ranch passed mostly in silence, broken only by Lily's occasional observations about cloud shapes or interesting birds. Margaret found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, not as a visitor, but as someone considering making this wild, beautiful country her home. When they arrived, Joshua led them not to the house, but to a hillock behind it, where a lone cottonwood tree spread its branches. A small, white-painted fence enclosed what was clearly a grave. "I thought you should meet Claire," he said quietly, "before you give your answer." The simple wooden marker bore the inscription, "Claire Elizabeth Kent, beloved wife and mother, 1853-1873, until we meet again." Margaret was deeply moved by the gesture. "Thank you for bringing me here." Lily knelt by the grave, arranging a small bouquet of late wildflowers she had gathered along the way. "I tell Ma about important things," she explained, "like school starting and Tommy's broken arm. And you." Joshua placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Claire would have liked you, Margaret. She valued education, wanted Lily to have opportunities she never had. She sounds like a remarkable young woman." She was. His voice held sadness, but no longer the raw pain Margaret had heard before. She'd want Lily to have a mother who could guide her, teach her. He met Margaret's gaze. "She'd approve of my choice, I think. Prove of my choice, I think. Prove." The moment felt sacred somehow, this acknowledgement of what had been lost and what might be found. "Shall we go to the house?" Joshua suggested, after a respectful silence. "We can talk there." In the library, the heart of the home, Margaret now realized. Joshua gestured for her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs by the window. Lily perched on the window seat, her expression serious. "Before you give your answer," Joshua began, "I want to be clear about what I'm offering. A true partnership, shared responsibility for this ranch, for Lily's upbringing, your own space and independence. The school will be your domain entirely." He paused. "And with time, I hope, genuine affection between us." Margaret nodded. "I appreciate your candor, and I've given this matter great thought." She drew a deep breath. "My answer is yes, Joshua, I will marry you." Lily's gasp of delight broke the tension. "However," Margaret continued, raising a hand to forestall premature celebration, "I have conditions of my own." Joshua's eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "I would expect nothing less. First, I will maintain my position as teacher regardless of our marriage. The school must remain my primary responsibility during term." He nodded. "Agreed." "Second, I would like us to court properly before the wedding. Not a lengthy engagement. I understand the practicalities of frontier life, but enough time to grow comfortable with one another first." "How long did you have in mind?" 1 month, Margaret proposed. Long enough to establish the school and for us to better understand each other, but not so long as to cause undue gossip. Acceptable, Joshua agreed, his expression softening. And your third condition, that Lily is consulted on all major decisions affecting this household. Margaret turned to the child. She has already lost one mother. She deserves a voice in how her home functions going forward. Lily's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears. She launched herself from the window seat into Margaret's arms. Does this mean you'll be my ma now? Margaret held the child close, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion. It means I'll be your stepmother, Lily. I won't replace your mother. No one could or should. But I'll love you and guide you as best I can. Over the child's head, she met Joshua's gaze. The tenderness in his eyes took her breath away. Are those your only conditions? He asked softly. Just one more, Margaret said. That you kiss me now, Joshua Kent, so we can both be certain this arrangement has the potential for something beyond mere practicality. His surprise gave way to a slow smile that transformed his face. He rose and came to kneel beside her chair, one hand gently tilting, her chin upward. With pleasure, he murmured, and then his lips were on hers, warm, gentle, questioning. The kiss was brief, but undeniably affecting. When they parted, Margaret knew with certainty that whatever else this marriage might be, it would not lack for passion. Well, Joshua asked, his voice slightly unsteady, I believe this arrangement has considerable potential, Margaret replied, her own composure not entirely intact. Lily, who had watched the kiss with fascinated attention, tugged at Joshua's sleeve. Does this mean Miss Blackwood is staying, Pa? For good and always? Joshua's eyes held Margaret's, his expression one of newfound hope. What do you think, Margaret? Is this wilderness home enough for a Boston schoolteacher? Margaret looked around the library, with its walls of books, at the child still half in her lap, at the man kneeling beside her, a man who had recognized his mistake and had the courage to correct it. Through the window, she could see the mountains, rising against the vast Montana sky, wild and challenging and breathtakingly beautiful. Not just enough, she said softly, more than I ever dared hope for. 1 month later, on a crisp October morning with aspen leaves turning gold on the hillsides, Margaret Blackwood became Margaret Kent in a simple ceremony at the Cottonwood Springs Church. The schoolhouse was completed, classes had begun, and her students, including Lily, were already showing remarkable progress. As she spoke her vows before the assembled townspeople, Margaret caught Mrs. Miller's approving smile from the front. "Ampew!" The landlady had become a dear friend, her practical wisdom a steadying influence during the whirlwind courtship. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Simmons declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Joshua's lips met hers to seal their union, Margaret reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. Rejected, then chosen. Lost, then found. Too old, then perfectly aged for the wisdom this family needed. Later, at the celebration held at the Kent Ranch, now her home, Margaret stood on the porch watching Joshua swing Lily in a joyful dance. While the townspeople clapped in rhythm, Dr. Sanders approached, offering a cup of punch. "You know," he said conversationally, "when Joshua first mentioned bringing a mail-order bride from Boston, I thought he was making a grave mistake. Told him so, in fact." "Did you?" Margaret sipped her punch, amused rather than offended. Warned him she'd probably be some delicate eastern flower who'd wilt at the first Montana winter. The doctor chuckled. "Shows what I know." "What changed your mind?" "Saw you set Tommy Jenkins's arm." He gestured with his cup toward where the boy played. "With the other children," his splint now removed. Man who finds a woman with both skill and compassion ought to count himself lucky, regardless of how many candles were on her last birthday cake. Margaret smiled. Joshua seems to have reached a similar conclusion. He's smarter than he looks. Dr. Sanders nodded toward where her new husband now approached, his face flushed from dancing. Most men are when they finally see what's right in front of them. As the doctor tactfully withdrew, Joshua took his place beside her. "Happy, Mrs. Kent?" "Contentedly so, Mr. Kent." She leaned slightly against his shoulder. "Any regrets? About Boston? Your teaching career there, the life you left behind?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I miss certain comforts and conveniences. I miss my father's library and the familiarity of streets I'd known since childhood." She turned to face him fully. "But regrets? No. What awaits me here holds far more promise than what I left behind." He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I'll do my best to ensure you never regret your decision." "I know." She squeezed his hand. "And I'll do my best to show you that wisdom has advantages youth can't match." His smile deepened the lines around his eyes. Lines she had come to find endearing rather than aging. "You've already proven that many times over." As twilight descended, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting golden pools of light against the gathering darkness. Lily ran up to them, breathless with excitement. "Pa! Ma! Mr. Jenkins says we should start the dancing proper. Will you show everyone how it's done?" The word "ma" still startled Margaret, but it warmed her heart nonetheless. She and Lily had agreed that mother belonged to Claire's memory, but ma could be hers. Joshua offered his arm with formal grace. "Shall we, Mrs. Kent?" As he led her to the center of the yard, where a space had been cleared for dancing, Margaret caught sight of their shadows stretching across the ground, two figures leaning slightly toward each other, neither young nor old, but somehow perfectly matched despite all odds. The fiddle struck up a waltz, and Joshua drew her into his arms. As they began to move in time to the music, Margaret realized that life, like this dance, was not about finding perfection, but about finding the right partner, someone who could match your steps, accommodate your missteps, and make the journey worthwhile. "Thank you," Joshua murmured as he guided her through a turn. "For what?" "For seeing the man beneath the fool who rejected you. For giving Lily the mother she needs. For bringing life back to this ranch." Margaret smiled up at him. No longer self-conscious about the silver in her hair or the lines beside her eyes. "Thank you for recognizing that some treasures improve with age." Around them, the community of Cottonwood Springs watched and celebrated, bearing witness to a union born not of youthful passion, but of mature understanding. A love all the more precious for being chosen with open eyes and full hearts. As the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Margaret Kent danced with her husband, surrounded by her new family and community, secure in the knowledge that she had found not just a home, but a purpose. Being too old had proven to be her greatest strength, the very quality that had ultimately won her the life she now cherished. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The autumn days grew shorter as September yielded to October, painting the cottonwood trees that gave the town its name in brilliant gold. Margaret settled into a rhythm divided between the schoolhouse and the Kent ranch, where she spent increasing amounts of time with Joshua and Lily as their courtship progressed. The school thrived under her guidance. What had been an empty shell 3 weeks earlier now bustled with activity. 27 students of varying ages and abilities gathered each morning, eager for the knowledge she offered. Margaret had arranged the space by ability rather than age, allowing older students who had missed formal education to learn without embarrassment alongside younger children of similar skill levels. "You've worked miracles here," Mayor Holt remarked during his inspection visit, gazing around at the neatly arranged desks, the maps and charts Joshua had helped her hang on freshly whitewashed walls, the small library of books donated by townspeople. "I must admit I had my doubts about bringing in an Eastern woman, but you've been pleasantly surprised," Margaret finished for him, suppressing her amusement at his transparent backpedaling. "The children are eager to learn. That makes my task considerably easier. In truth, the work was exhausting, assessing each child's abilities, creating appropriate lessons for multiple levels, maintaining discipline while fostering curiosity." Each evening, Margaret returned to Mrs. Miller's boarding house with ink-stained fingers and a voice hoarse from hours of instruction. Yet the fatigue was different from what she had known in Boston. It carried the satisfaction of building something meaningful, of witnessing young minds unfold like desert flowers after rain. And then there were the evenings and weekends with Joshua and Lily. Their courtship unfolded with the same practical directness that characterized the man himself. No flowery declarations or extravagant gestures, but rather a steady deepening of mutual respect and affection expressed through shared activities and thoughtful conversations. Joshua took her fishing along the creek that bordered his property, patiently showing her how to cast the line and wait for the subtle tug that signaled a bite. In return, she read aloud from his library while he worked on repairs around the house, her trained voice bringing Shakespeare and Dickens to life in the quiet evenings. These moments revealed the man beneath the stoic rancher's exterior, his dry humor, his unexpected knowledge of literature and history, his deep commitment to building a civilized outpost in this wilderness. Most surprising was his willingness to listen to her opinions, not merely with tolerance, but with genuine interest. "You've thought deeply about education," he commented one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard. "Not just the mechanics of teaching, but its purpose." "My father believed education was more than facts and figures," Margaret replied, warmed by his observation. "He saw it as the shaping of character, the cultivation of both mind and soul, a philosophy I share." Joshua turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "It's what I want for Lily, not just knowledge, but wisdom. The ability to think for herself, to question, to grow. That's harder to teach than geography or arithmetic," Margaret admitted, "but infinitely more valuable." Something shifted in Joshua's gaze, a softening that made her breath catch. "You understand what matters to me. That's rare." The moment hung between them, intimate and charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Lily bounded up the porch steps, breaking the spell with her excited chatter about the fireflies she'd captured in a jar. Such moments accumulated like pearls on a string, small, precious instances of connection that gradually transformed their arrangement from practical partnership to something deeper. Margaret found herself watching for Joshua's wagon each afternoon, her heart quickening at the sight of his tall figure striding toward the schoolhouse to escort her to the ranch for supper. Mrs. Miller observed these developments with knowing eyes but kept her comments to herself, save for an occasional smile when Margaret returned later each evening, her cheeks flushed with more than just the autumn chill. "The whole town's talking," Clara Jenkins remarked one morning as she delivered. "Fresh eggs to the boarding house. Betting on when the wedding will be. Some say you'll wait till spring, but most think it'll be before the first snow." "Do they indeed?" Margaret replied, amused rather than offended by the town's interest in her courtship. "And what's your prediction?" "Mrs. Jenkins, Halloween," Clara said decisively. "Practical time for a wedding, harvest done, winter preparations complete, but before the bad weather sets in. Plus," she added with a conspiratorial wink, "the dress I'm sewing for you will be finished by then." Margaret blinked in surprise. Dress? What dress? Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, was I not supposed to mention it? Joshua ordered the fabric special from Helena, a beautiful deep blue wool with black velvet trim. Said it would match your eyes. Warmth bloomed in Margaret's chest at this revelation. She hadn't expected such thoughtfulness, such attention to detail. The Joshua Kent who had rejected her at the train station would never have considered the color of her eyes when selecting fabric. The man she was coming to know, to care for deeply, was revealing himself layer by layer, like the mountains that shed their morning mist to show their true majesty. That evening, as they sat before the fire in the ranch house library, Margaret found herself studying Joshua's profile, noting how the firelight softened the lines of weariness around his eyes and mouth. Clara Jenkins mentioned a dress today, she said casually, curious to see his reaction. Joshua's hands stilled on the leather harness he was mending. A faint color rose in his cheeks, the first time she had seen him genuinely flustered. That was meant to be a surprise. It still is, Margaret assured him. I know nothing beyond its existence and color. He set the harness aside, meeting her gaze directly. You deserve a proper wedding dress, something beautiful, not just practical. Blue with black velvet, she mused. An unusual choice for a bride. You're an unusual bride? His voice deepened slightly. I thought it would complement your eyes and your dignity. White seemed inappropriate for both of us. The sensitivity behind his reasoning touched her deeply. Thank you. It sounds perfect. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Lily's soft breathing from where she had fallen asleep on the rug, with a book of fairy tales open beside her. We should discuss the date, Joshua said finally, if you're still certain about this marriage. I am. The words came without hesitation, surprising even Margaret with their certainty. When had her decision solidified from tentative agreement to absolute commitment? Perhaps during one of their long conversations about books and ideas, or while watching him teach Lily to saddle her pony with endless patience, or in the way he sought her counsel on ranch matters as an equal partner, rather than a subordinate. I was thinking after harvest, he continued. Late October, perhaps. Halloween? Margaret suggested with a small smile. Mrs. Jenkins predicted as much. Joshua's eyebrows rose. The town's placing bets, I take it. Apparently so. He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. Let's not disappoint them then. Halloween it is. As he reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, Margaret marveled at how comfortable his touch had become. How natural it felt to have his calloused fingers envelop hers, to feel the steady strength in his grip. There's something else we should discuss, Joshua said, his tone turning serious. Living arrangements before the wedding. Margaret tensed slightly. Though their courtship had progressed into increasingly affectionate territory, stolen kisses on the porch, lingering embraces when they parted each evening, they had maintained propriety's boundaries. The town might gossip about their relationship, but no one could claim impropriety. I've spoken with Mrs. Miller, Joshua continued. She agrees it would be appropriate for you to move to the ranch soon, with proper chaperonage, of course. Chaperonage, Margaret repeated, puzzled. Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to stay at the ranch until the wedding. She'll sleep in the room adjoining yours. His lips quirked in a half-smile. To preserve your reputation, such as it is after weeks of spending every evening here. The consideration behind this arrangement, his concern for her standing in the community despite their engagement, added another layer to her growing affection for this complex man. Thank you, she said softly. When did you have in mind? This weekend? The schoolhouse is running smoothly, and having you here would make preparations for the wedding easier. His eyes held a question beyond the practical reasons offered. And Lily would be overjoyed to have you here full-time. Only Lily? Margaret teased gently. Joshua's expression grew serious. "You know better than that. You know better than that. You know—" The simple statement, devoid of flowery declarations yet profoundly sincere, affected Margaret more deeply than elaborate protestations of devotion might have. This was the essence of the man she had agreed to marry. Straightforward, honest, expressing his feelings through actions rather than words. "This weekend, then," she agreed. The transition from Mrs. Miller's boarding house to the Kent ranch unfolded with minimal fanfare but considerable emotional resonance. Margaret had accumulated few possessions during her short time in Cottonwood: Springs, her books, the clothing she had brought from Boston, and a few items purchased from the general store. Everything fit into 2 trunks that Joshua loaded onto his wagon on a crisp Saturday morning. Mrs. Miller embraced her on the porch, her usual brusque manner softening into genuine affection. "You've made the right choice," she murmured. "That man looks at you like you've brought the sun back to his world." "He's a good man," Margaret acknowledged, returning the embrace. "Better than I initially gave him credit for." "Most are, when given the chance to prove it." Mrs. Miller pressed a small package into her hands. "A wedding gift. Open it when you're alone." The drive to the ranch carried a different weight than the previous journeys along the same road. Margaret watched the landscape pass, the golden fields, the distant mountains touched with the first snow of the season, the cottonwood trees shedding their leaves in bright cascades, knowing that this beauty was now hers to claim, to belong to in a way she had never belonged anywhere. Lily waited, on the porch, practically vibrating with excitement. "You're staying forever now," she declared as Margaret descended from the wagon. "Pa says we have to still be proper until the wedding, but you're really living here now." "Almost forever," Margaret corrected, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. "There's still the small matter of a wedding first." Mrs. Jenkins emerged from the house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Welcome home, Miss Blackwood. I've prepared your room and baked a special supper to celebrate." Home. The word resonated in Margaret's chest with unexpected force. She had called many places home over her 38 years: her father's house in Boston, the small apartment above the school, temporary lodgings during the war, Mrs. Miller's boarding house. But none had ever felt as right, as meant to be, as this ranch with its sturdy house and library full of books and the small family. That would soon be hers. The days that followed developed a rhythm different from their previous courtship. Living under the same roof, even with Mrs. Jenkins' vigilant chaperoning, allowed Margaret to witness the daily realities of life with Joshua and Lily. Morning routines, division of chores, the small frictions and adjustments that came with sharing space. Joshua rose before dawn each day to tend to the livestock, returning to the house as Margaret and Lily prepared breakfast. They ate together before Margaret and Lily departed for school, Joshua for his ranch work. Evenings were devoted to shared meals, homework supervision, and quiet hours in the library before retiring to separate bedrooms under Mrs. Jenkins' watchful eye. It was during these domestic moments that Margaret truly came to know her future husband, not the formal suitor who had courted her with careful respect, but the man himself with all his complexities. She discovered his habit of humming tunelessly while reading, his preference for coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, his unexpected skill at darning socks during evening conversations. She learned that he grew taciturn when tired, but never short-tempered, that he maintained Claire's grave with weekly visits, that he kept a journal of Lily's childhood milestones and funny sayings. These intimate details, the kind known only to those who share living quarters, endeared him to her, in ways grand gestures never could. This was the substance of marriage, Margaret realized. Not romance and passion alone, but the steady accumulation of shared experiences, the gradual intertwining of lives through mundane moments as well as significant ones, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret opened Mrs. Miller's gift in the privacy of her bedroom. Inside the carefully wrapped package lay a nightgown of fine white cotton, embroidered at the neck and wrists with delicate blue flowers. A small note accompanied it, for a woman embarking on a new beginning. May it serve as a reminder that life offers second chances at any age. Ida Miller. Margaret traced the embroidery with trembling fingers, understanding the message beneath the gift. Their courtship had been necessarily abbreviated by frontier. Practicalities, the physical aspects of their relationship limited to kisses and embraces. Soon those boundaries would dissolve, and she, a spinster of 38 who had long ago resigned herself to solitude, would become a wife in every sense. The prospect both terrified and exhilarated her. She had no illusions about marriage, no girlish fantasies of what awaited, but she had seen the way Joshua looked at her when he thought she wasn't aware, with appreciation, with desire, with a hunger that matched her own awakening feelings. As wedding preparations accelerated, the entire town became involved. The church was decorated with autumn bounty, sheaves of wheat, pumpkins, late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the schoolchildren. Clara Jenkins completed the blue wool dress, which fit Margaret's figure perfectly, accentuating her still trim waist and complementing her dark hair with its threads of silver. "You look beautiful," Lily declared during the final fitting. "Like a queen in the storybooks." Margaret smoothed the rich fabric, admiring the skilled construction. "Your father chose well. He said you deserved something as dignified and beautiful as you are," Lily reported, clearly repeating words she had overheard. "Said most brides wear white to look pure, but you didn't need to pretend anything." The artless comment brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Here was confirmation of what she had begun to believe, that Joshua valued her exactly as she was, with all the experience and wisdom her years had brought, not despite them, but because of them. The night before the wedding, after Lily had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Joshua asked Margaret to join him on the porch. The October air carried a bite of winter, but the sky blazed with stars in a display impossible to see in Boston's light-polluted skies. "Nervous?" he asked as they settled on the porch swing, a quilt drawn over their laps against the chill. Little," Margaret admitted, appreciating his directness, "though not about marrying you." "What then?" She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't offend. "The transition. From independence to partnership, from Margaret Blackwood to Margaret Kent." Joshua nodded, understanding without explanation. "You won't lose yourself in becoming my wife. I didn't choose you for your ability to disappear into this household, but for the strength and wisdom you bring to it. I know." She leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "It's just, I've been alone for so long. Made all my own decisions, answered to no one. That won't change," he promised. "Not fundamentally. We'll make decisions together, but I don't expect or want you to surrender your independence. The school remains your domain entirely." His understanding eased a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged. "Thank you." They sat in companionable silence, the swing creaking gently beneath them. Finally, Joshua spoke again, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "I have a confession to make." Margaret turned to look at him, concerned by his serious tone. "What is it?" "That telegram I sent to Boston, breaking off our arrangement before you arrived." He hesitated. "I never actually sent it." She stared at him, processing this revelation. "But the station master said..." I told him to say that, Joshua admitted, looking ashamed. I saw you from the station window, noticed your silver hair, and panicked. I was a coward, Margaret. Instead of meeting you face to face as I'd promised, I hid behind a lie. The admission should have angered her, but instead Margaret found it strangely touching. This evidence of his remorse, his need to begin their marriage with complete honesty. Why tell me now? She asked. Because I want no secrets between us when we stand before Reverend Simmons tomorrow. He turned to face her fully. I was wrong, not just in my judgment of what I needed, but in how I treated you. I've regretted it every day since. Margaret considered his confession, weighing it against all she had come to know about this man. Thank you for telling me. It couldn't have been easy. Easier than living with the lie. He caught her hand in his. I want you to know the man. You're marrying, flaws and all. I do, she assured him. Better than you might think. They remained on the porch until the chill became too much to bear, talking of small things and large, plans for the wedding, hopes for the school, dreams for Lily's future. When they finally rose to go inside, Joshua drew Margaret into his arms for a lingering embrace. Tomorrow, he murmured against her hair, you become my wife. Tomorrow, she agreed, her heart full with anticipation and certainty. Dawn broke clear and cold on Halloween morning. Margaret woke to the sound of activity downstairs, voices, footsteps, the clatter of dishes. For a moment, she lay still, absorbing the reality that this was her wedding day. Not as she had once imagined it in her girlhood dreams, but infinitely more precious for being unexpected, unplanned, a gift life had reserved for her middle years. A knock at her door preceded Lily's entrance. The child already dressed in her best frock, her dark hair neatly braided. Ma says it's time to get ready. Everyone's coming to help. Ma? Margaret questioned, sitting up. Lily climbed onto the bed beside her. Mrs. Jenkins says I should practice calling you Ma, since you'll be my Ma after today. Is that all right? The simple question brought tears to Margaret's eyes. It's more than all right, Lily. It's a great honor. The morning passed in a flurry of preparations. Mrs. Miller arrived with breakfast and practical advice. Clara Jenkins brought the finished wedding dress. Several other women from town appeared with flowers, food for the reception, and offers of assistance with hair and attire. Through it all, Margaret maintained a center of calm certainty. When she finally stood before the mirror in the blue wool dress, her hair arranged in a sophisticated knot adorned with late autumn roses, she hardly recognized the woman who gazed back at her. Not because she looked younger, the silver in her hair still caught the light, the fine lines at her eyes and mouth remained, but because she looked transformed, confident, serene, beloved. You look radiant, Mrs. Miller declared, adjusting the cameo brooch at Margaret's throat, her mother's the one tangible connection to her past life. I feel it, Margaret admitted. Is that strange, to feel so certain about marrying a man I barely knew 6 weeks ago? Time measures poorly against understanding, Mrs. Miller replied with unexpected wisdom. Some people could live side by side for decades and never truly know each other. Others recognize kindred spirits in an instant. A knock at the bedroom door announced Joshua's arrival to escort her to the church. When Margaret emerged, she found him waiting in the hallway, resplendent in a new black suit, his hair freshly trimmed, his expression a mixture of awe and tenderness. Margaret, he breathed, the single word conveying volumes. She took his offered arm, feeling the slight tremor in his usually steady hands. Ready, Mr. Kent? More than you know, Miss Blackwood. His smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. For the last time. They rode to the church in a wagon decorated with autumn leaves and ribbons, Lily between them, chattering excitedly about the celebration to follow. The entire town had turned out for the occasion. Every resident of Cottonwood Springs crowded into the small church or spilled onto the grounds outside, Reverend Simmons, who had once questioned Margaret's suitability as a teacher based on her age and marital status, now beamed at the couple as they stood before him. The ceremony itself was simple, frontier, practical, but deeply meaningful. When Margaret spoke her vows, her voice carried the conviction of a woman who had chosen this path with eyes wide open, heart fully engaged. I, Margaret, take you, Joshua, to be my husband, to share in life's joys and sorrows, to stand beside you in prosperity and hardship, to build a home and family together from this day forward. Joshua's hands held hers firmly as he repeated similar words, his deep voice steady and sure. Then came the moment for rings, a detail Margaret had not considered amid all the other preparations. To her surprise, Lily stepped forward, presenting a small velvet pouch. "Pa had these made special," she announced importantly. From the pouch, Joshua withdrew 2 gold bands. He slipped the smaller one onto Margaret's finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. Then, in a gesture that moved her deeply, he knelt to Lily's height. "This day isn't just about Margaret and me," he said, loud enough for the congregation to hear, but pitched intimately for his daughter. "It's about our family, the 3 of us becoming whole. Will you accept this as a symbol of that promise?" From the pouch, he withdrew a 3rd, smaller ring on a delicate gold chain. Lily's eyes widened as he fastened it around her neck. "When you're grown," he explained, "you can wear it on your finger. Until then, keep it close to your heart, a reminder that you are loved beyond measure by both of us." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Lily threw her arms around her father, then reached for Margaret to include her in the embrace. They stood together, a family circle, complete and perfect in its imperfections. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Simmons declared, his own voice suspiciously thick, "I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that sealed their union was brief but tender, appropriate for a public ceremony, yet carrying undercurrents of promise for the private celebrations to come. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Joshua Kent, Margaret caught sight of familiar faces, Mrs. Miller dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Dr. Sanders nodding approvingly, the Jenkins family beaming, her students watching with wide-eyed fascination. All these people who had become her community, her support, her friends in the space of mere weeks. The reception that followed at the ranch was a true frontier celebration. Tables groaned with food, contributed by every family in town. Fiddle music filled the air as couples danced in the yard. Children played games organized by the older students. Through it all, Margaret moved with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world, accepting congratulations, sharing laughter, watching her new husband interact with their neighbors and friends. As the afternoon waned toward evening, Joshua appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of a man who now possessed that right. "Happy, Mrs. Kent?" he murmured in her ear. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace, "though I must admit to a certain anticipation for when our guests depart." A flush crept up his neck at her forthright comment. "Mrs. Jenkins has taken Lily to stay with them tonight. The house will be ours alone." The promise in his words sent a pleasant shiver through Margaret. Despite her age, despite her practicality, she was not immune to the desire that had been building between them throughout their courtship, the natural progression of affection into passion. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, the celebration continued with undiminished enthusiasm. Yet Margaret noticed Joshua checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency, his attention to their guests becoming more perfunctory as the evening progressed. Finally, Dr. Sanders approached, clapping Joshua on the shoulder. "Time to let you two begin your married life properly," he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Everyone's had their fill of food and dancing. No need to drag this out until midnight." Joshua's relief was palpable. "You have our gratitude, Doctor." With surprising efficiency, the townspeople gathered their belongings, collected their children, and began departing with final congratulations and knowing smiles. Within half an hour, the yard was empty, save for a few ranch hands tasked with clearing away the remnants of the celebration. Joshua dismissed them with thanks and generous payment for their extra work. "Leave the rest until morning," he instructed. "You've earned your rest." Then, with deliberate steps, he approached Margaret, where she stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Without a word, he swept her into his arms. "Joshua!" she gasped, surprised by the sudden movement. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he replied, his eyes dark with an emotion that made her breath catch. "An old tradition, worth honoring, don't you think?" As he carried her through the doorway into their home, truly theirs now in every sense, Margaret felt a surging joy unlike anything she had experienced before. Not the giddy infatuation of youth, but something deeper, richer, more enduring. A happiness built on foundation stones of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection that had grown, against all odds, into love. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world and all its judgments. Before them stretched the beginning of their shared life, a future neither had anticipated, but both now embraced with open hearts and clear eyes. "Welcome home, Margaret Kent," Joshua murmured, setting her gently on her feet, but keeping her within the circle of his arms. "Home," she repeated, the word carrying all the warmth and belonging she had sought throughout her journey west. At last. At last. Joshua, infected by their enthusiasm, rode into the foothills to select and cut the perfect tree, a 7-foot blue spruce that filled the parlor with its fresh, resinous scent. Together, the three of them decorated it with all the handmade ornaments Margaret and Lily had crafted during evenings by the fire. Paper stars dusted with flour to resemble snow, pine cones tied with red ribbon, strings of dried apple slices and popcorn, and small fabric sachets filled with cinnamon sticks. "It's the most beautiful tree in all of Montana Territory," Lily declared, dancing around it in delight. "Maybe in the whole world." "I believe you're right," Margaret agreed, adjusting a slightly drooping branch. "Your father chose perfectly." Joshua watched them from the doorway, his expression one of profound contentment. "It's not the tree that makes it beautiful," he said quietly. "It's who's gathered around it." The remark, simple but heartfelt, exemplified the changes in the man Margaret had married. The practical rancher who had once valued utility above sentiment now recognized the importance of beauty, of celebration, of marking moments with those he loved. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Margaret woke early, slipping from bed without disturbing Joshua to complete her final preparations. She had saved a small portion of her teaching salary for gifts, practical items embellished with personal touches that transformed them from mere necessities to treasures. For Lily, she had prepared a set of handmade watercolor paints derived from natural materials, berries, roots, minerals, accompanied by a proper artist's sketchbook ordered from Helena. For Joshua, she had commissioned a leather-bound journal from the saddle maker in town, its cover embossed with the Kent Ranch brand and the first page inscribed with a verse from Emerson that had featured in their earliest correspondence. When Lily's excited footsteps pattered down the hallway at dawn, Margaret was waiting in the parlor, a fire already crackling in the hearth, spiced cider warming on the small brazier. "Merry Christmas, Lily," she greeted the child, who stood wide-eyed in her nightgown, gazing at the presents arranged beneath the tree. More than the girl had expected, certainly. Did Santa Claus really come? Lily whispered, approaching the tree with reverence. See for yourself, Margaret encouraged, enjoying the child's wonder. At 6, Lily balanced precariously between childhood faith and growing awareness of adult realities. Margaret saw no harm in preserving the magic of Christmas for another year. Joshua appeared in the doorway, his hair still tousled from sleep, his expression softening at the tableau before him. "Well now, it seems we've been visited in the night." The morning unfolded in a haze of joy. Lily's delight at her new paints, her father's handcrafted wooden toys, and the candy sticks and oranges that were rare luxuries on the frontier. Joshua's quiet appreciation of his journal, his fingers tracing the embossed leather with evident emotion. And Margaret's surprise at her own gifts, a set of tortoise-shell combs for her hair from Lily, and from Joshua, a properly equipped writing desk for the corner of their bedroom, so you can continue your correspondence with your Boston friends in comfort, he explained, as she examined the desk's features. Compartments for paper and envelopes, a proper inkwell, a pen rest. And perhaps start that book you've mentioned. The thoughtfulness of the gift moved her deeply. During their evening conversations, Margaret had occasionally mentioned a long-held dream of writing educational materials specifically designed for frontier schools, that Joshua had not only remembered but taken action to support this aspiration, demonstrated his commitment to her fulfillment beyond her roles as wife, mother, and teacher. "It's perfect," she said simply, embracing him with unabashed affection, despite Lily's theatrical grimace at such adult behavior. The remainder of the day passed in pleasant activities, a special dinner with roast chicken and mince pies prepared. Together in the kitchen, stories read aloud by the fire, and finally, a surprise visit from the Jenkins family, bearing additional gifts and contributing to the festive atmosphere. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, exhausted but content, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The heartbreak of her school's closure, the desperate decision to answer a stranger's advertisement, the humiliation of rejection, and the unexpected second chance that had led to this life of purpose and love. "You're smiling," Joshua observed, entering their bedroom from his nightly check of the livestock. "Pleasant thoughts?" "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out," Margaret admitted, unpinning her hair at the dressing table. "If you hadn't reconsidered your first impression of me." Joshua crossed to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror's reflection. "One of the few wise decisions I've made in my life," he said, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Though I'm still ashamed it took me so long to recognize what was right in front of me." "All's well that ends well," Margaret quoted softly. "Not ended," Joshua corrected, "merely begun." The truth of his statement resonated through the remainder of that winter and into the spring that followed. Their life together was indeed a beginning, not an ending, a continuous unfolding of possibilities rather than the diminishment Margaret had once feared her advancing years might bring. The school expanded in the spring with the arrival of 3 new families to Cottonwood Springs, drawn by reports of fertile land and a proper education for their children. The town council, impressed by Margaret's success, allocated funds for additional books and a second room to be added to the schoolhouse. "We're growing," Mayor Holt announced proudly during the town meeting in April. "Cottonwood Springs is becoming a proper settlement, largely thanks to our schoolmistress. Families don't put down roots where their children can't be educated." The compliment brought color to Margaret's cheeks, but satisfaction to her heart. She had found not just personal happiness, but professional fulfillment in this remote outpost, an opportunity to shape young minds, and through them, the future. Of the community itself, the Kent Ranch prospered as well. Joshua's careful management, combined with Margaret's organizational skills and bookkeeping expertise, resulted in expanded operations. They hired 2 additional hands that spring, purchased adjacent land from a discouraged settler returning east, and increased their cattle herd by a third. "We make a good team," Joshua remarked as they reviewed the ledgers one evening in May. "Your Eastern education and my Western practicality." "The best of both worlds," Margaret agreed, pleased by his acknowledgement of their complementary strengths. Lily thrived under their joint guidance. Her reading advanced far beyond her years, her natural curiosity nurtured by Margaret's educational approach and Joshua's patient explanations of ranch operations. She grew an inch taller, lost 2 baby teeth, and developed an unexpected talent for drawing that Margaret encouraged with steadfast enthusiasm. Yet for all the external markers of success, the prosperous ranch, the thriving school, the growing child, it was the private moments that Margaret treasured most. The quiet conversations with Joshua after Lily had gone to bed, where they discussed books and ideas as equals. The Sunday afternoon rides to the foothills, where they would spread a blanket and simply exist together in comfortable silence. The nights when they turned to each other with a passion that seemed to deepen rather than diminish with familiarity. These were the true measures of their marriage, the 1,000 small intimacies that bound them more securely than any wedding vow. The way Joshua automatically poured her coffee exactly as she preferred it, without being asked. The way Margaret learned to interpret his moods from the set of his shoulders when he returned from a day's work. The private language of glances and gestures they developed, allowing silent communication across a crowded room. Spring blossomed into summer, the Montana landscape transforming from snow-covered dormancy to explosive fertility. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows surrounding the ranch, the vegetable garden yielded its first tender greens, and the days stretched long and golden. On the anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Cottonwood Springs, a date Joshua had marked carefully. In his calendar, he surprised her with a special dinner after Lily had been tucked into bed. "What's the occasion?" Margaret asked, taking in the table set with their best china, candles lending a soft glow to the dining room that was typically used only for company. 1 year ago today, a remarkable woman stepped off the train in Cottonwood Springs. Joshua replied, holding her chair, "A woman who would change everything, though I was too blind to see it at first." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "You're becoming quite sentimental, Mr. Kent. You bring it out in me, Mrs. Kent." He poured wine into their glasses, a luxury saved for special occasions. "I have something for you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch similar to the one that had held their wedding rings. Margaret accepted it curiously, loosening the drawstring to reveal a delicate gold brooch fashioned in the shape of a book, its cover inlaid with a tiny pearl. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully from the pouch. "Open it," Joshua encouraged. Margaret discovered that the brooch was indeed a locket of sorts. The book opened to reveal tiny compartments, one containing a lock of Lily's dark hair, the other a miniature portrait of Joshua drawn by a traveling artist who had passed through town the previous month. "So you can keep us close, even when you're at the school," Joshua explained. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I shall treasure it always." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I've been thinking about the letter I wrote, the one that brought you here. Do you remember what I said I was looking for? In a wife? An educated, practical woman who appreciated books and wasn't afraid of hard work," Margaret recalled with a smile. "Rather specific criteria, and yet completely inadequate," Joshua mused. "I never mentioned wisdom or compassion or the ability to see beyond surface appearances to the heart of things. I never thought to ask for a woman who could challenge me intellectually while supporting me emotionally. I never dared hope for a love that would make every day brighter by its presence. Joshua, Margaret murmured, moved by this unexpected eloquence from her usually reticent husband. I got so much more than I asked for, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Because of one simple mistake, rejecting you before I truly saw you. He raised his glass. To mistakes that lead to blessings. As they dined by candlelight, sharing memories of their first contentious meetings and the gradual change of heart that had followed, Margaret reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this happiness. The rejection that had seemed so devastating had been merely a detour, not an ending. The silver in her hair that had initially repelled Joshua now seemed to fascinate him. He often traced the strands with gentle fingers when they lay together in the darkness. Time, that merciless adversary she had once feared, had proven her greatest ally. For it was time that had given her the wisdom to navigate loss and change, the perspective to value substance over appearance, the patience to allow love to develop naturally rather than grasping desperately at its promise. "What are you thinking?" Joshua asked, noticing her contemplative expression. That being too old turned out to be exactly right, Margaret replied with a smile. For both of us. Later that night, as they stood on the porch watching summer stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Joshua wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, the question he had posed so many times during their courtship and early marriage, as if continually reassuring himself that she had no regrets. "Completely," Margaret answered, leaning back against his solid strength, "though I do wonder sometimes." "About what?" "About that young woman you thought you wanted when you placed your advertisement. The one without silver in her hair or lines. By her eyes." She kept her tone light, but the question had lingered occasionally in quiet moments. "Do you ever wish—" "Never," Joshua interrupted firmly, turning her to face him. "Not for a single moment. That young woman existed only in my imagination, a fantasy born of grief and misunderstanding of my own needs." His hands framed her face with tender reverence. "You, with your wisdom and your strength, your experience and your compassion, you are the reality that outshines any youthful dreams. The conviction in his voice dispelled the last whisper of doubt Margaret had harbored. This was no mere compromise or settling, no practical arrangement that denied deeper desires. This was a love born of true recognition, soul recognizing soul. Across the artificial boundaries of age and circumstance. "I love you, Joshua Kent," she said simply, the words carrying all the certainty that their year together had built. "And I love you, Margaret Kent," he replied, his kiss sealing the declaration beneath the vast Montana sky. As summer progressed into its fullness, bringing long, light-drenched days and the heady scent of hay being cut in the surrounding fields, life at the Kent Ranch settled into a rhythm of productive contentment. Margaret divided her time between preparing for the next school term, assisting with ranch operations, and creating the warm, cultured home environment she had always envisioned. The town of Cottonwood Springs continued to grow, attracting new settlers drawn by reports of fertile land and the increasingly rare combination of frontier opportunity and civilized amenities. Margaret's school became a particular point of pride for the community, a tangible symbol of their aspirations beyond mere survival. "We're building something lasting here," Joshua observed one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching Lily chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Not just a ranch or a school, but a foundation for what this territory might become. Place where age and experience are valued alongside youth and vigor," Margaret added, thinking of how the town had embraced her despite her initial concerns about being too old for frontier life. "A place where second chances are possible," Joshua agreed, his hand finding hers in the fading light. As they watched their daughter, for Lily was truly Margaret's now in heart if not in blood, darting through the twilight with a mason jar. To capture the glowing insects, Margaret felt a wave of gratitude so profound it momentarily took her breath away. This was a fullness of life she had never dared imagine when boarding that train in Boston. Not merely happiness, though that was abundant, but purpose, meaning, the sense of having found precisely where and with whom she belonged. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for being too old had discovered, against all expectations, that her age was not a liability but her greatest asset. The wisdom of her years, the perspective gained through loss and disappointment, the patience cultivated through experience, these were the very qualities that had enabled her to build this remarkable second act. "Look!" Lily called excitedly, running toward them with her jar glowing with captured fireflies. "They're like stars you can hold in your hands." "Beautiful," Margaret agreed, making room for the child on the porch swing between her and Joshua. "But remember, we must release them before bedtime. Even the brightest stars need their freedom." As the three of them sat together, watching the intermittent glow of the insects in the jar, Margaret thought about the letter she had received just yesterday from her friend Harriet in Boston, the same friend whose telegram a year ago had confirmed. "There was nothing left for her in the East. I confess I feared for you," Harriet had written. "A respectable spinster of 38, venturing alone into that wilderness on the promise of marriage to a stranger, and then to learn he had rejected you upon arrival. It seemed the cruelest of fates. How wrong I was to doubt Providence's plan. Your letters paint a picture of such contentment, such purpose, that I find myself almost envious. Perhaps there is wisdom in taking risks, even or especially when society deems us too old for such adventures." Too old. The phrase that had once wounded her now struck Margaret as almost laughable in its misapprehension. For what was age but a collection of experiences, a gathering of wisdom? And what was wisdom but the most valuable currency in building a meaningful life? "Penny for your thoughts," Joshua murmured, his arm stretching along the back of the swing to touch her shoulder. "I was thinking about time," Margaret replied honestly, "about how differently we view it at different stages of life. When I was Lily's age, a single day could feel eternal. In my 20s, I was always rushing forward, impatient for the next milestone. Now," she smiled at both her husband and her daughter, "now I find myself wanting to slow each moment, to savor it fully before it passes." "That's wisdom," Joshua observed, "the kind that comes only with years. The kind I might have missed if you'd held firm to your desire for a younger bride," Margaret teased gently. Joshua's expression grew serious. "The greatest blessing of my life was realizing my mistake before it was too late, before you gave up on me entirely." "I'm rather stubborn," Margaret admitted with a smile, "a quality that apparently improves with age." Lily, listening to this exchange with the solemn attention she often brought to adult conversations, suddenly spoke. "I'm glad you're not young, like Billy Jenkins' new mama. She doesn't know anything about anything. She can't even read big words or make watercolor paints from berries." The child's candid assessment brought laughter from both Margaret and Joshua, the easy, shared mirth of parents amused by their offspring's observations. "Youth has its own virtues," Margaret reminded her gently. "Energy, optimism, freshness. Of perspective, Mrs. Jenkins will learn the rest in time." "But I got lucky," Lily declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I got a mama who already knows everything important." As night deepened around the Kent ranch, bringing with it the profound quiet of the Montana wilderness, broken only by the occasional coyote call or settling timber of their home, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of belonging. The mail-order bride agreement that had seemed her last, desperate chance at a meaningful life had indeed transformed her future, though not in the way she had anticipated. The silver in her hair that had nearly cost her this. Happiness now caught the lamplight as Joshua gently removed her hairpins later that night, his touch reverent as always. The lines beside her eyes that she had once viewed with dismay now crinkled in genuine laughter as they shared private jokes in the sanctuary of their bedroom. "You're beautiful," Joshua murmured, as he did nearly every night, not with the blind adoration of youthful infatuation, but with the deep appreciation of a man who saw clearly and valued truly. And in his eyes, Margaret knew herself to be exactly that. Beautiful, not despite her years, but because of them. Beautiful in the fullness of her wisdom, her patience, her hard-won certainty about what mattered in life. She had been rejected for being too old, only to be chosen for the exact same reason by a man wise enough to recognize that some treasures improved with time. Like a fine wine, like a well-crafted story, like a love built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Too old, it turned out, was exactly old enough to recognize true happiness when it appeared, and to embrace it with the wholehearted appreciation that only experience could bring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 5 years had transformed Cottonwood Springs from a struggling frontier outpost into a thriving community. New buildings lined the main street, a proper hotel replacing the modest boarding house, a millinery shop, a photographer's studio, even a small lending library inspired by Margaret's passionate advocacy for education. The twice-weekly stagecoach arrived punctually, bringing mail, supplies, and occasional visitors from the east, curious about this remote settlement that had developed such a sterling reputation. At the heart of this transformation stood the schoolhouse, now expanded to 3 rooms, with 2 additional teachers hired to assist Margaret Kent, whose educational methods had drawn attention throughout Montana Territory. The annual examinations, conducted by a superintendent from Helena, consistently showed Cottonwood Springs students outperforming those from larger settlements. "Your wife has built something remarkable here," Governor Potts himself commented to Joshua during his inspection tour of the territory. "We need more educators of her caliber if Montana is to achieve statehood." Pride warmed Joshua's expression as he watched Margaret across the crowded town hall, where a reception honored the governor's visit. At 43, she stood straight and dignified, her dark hair now liberally streaked with silver, her blue dress, the same shade as the one he had ordered for their wedding, setting off her still handsome features. 5 years of marriage had only deepened his appreciation for the woman who had transformed not just his home, but his entire understanding of what mattered in a partnership. Her wisdom guided the education of their community's children. Her practical intelligence had helped expand their ranch into one of the most prosperous in the valley. Her steady affection had healed wounds he thought would pain him forever. Pa. Lily, now 11 and tall for her age, appeared at his elbow. "Ma says the governor wants to speak with both of you about the Territorial Education Committee." Joshua smiled at his daughter, noting the proud way she referred to Margaret as Ma, a title freely chosen and fiercely defended against anyone who referred to her as merely a stepmother. "Lead the way, Lily girl." As they crossed the room, Joshua caught Margaret's eye over the heads of the assembled townspeople. The private smile they exchanged spoke volumes about the bond they had forged, a connection rooted not in youthful passion, but in mature partnership, no less powerful for its practical foundations. Later that evening, after the governor's party had departed and Lily had gone to bed, they sat together on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching summer lightning play across distant mountains. "The governor offered me a position," Margaret said quietly, breaking their companionable silence, overseeing curriculum development for the entire territory. Joshua turned to her, not entirely surprised. He had witnessed the governor's obvious admiration for Margaret's educational achievements. In Helena, yes, it would mean leaving the school here, though I could recommend my replacement. She searched his face. It would also mean dividing our family for months at a time, unless you and Lily relocated with me. And abandon the ranch? Margaret shook her head. I declined the offer, Joshua. My place is here, with my family, with the school I've built, with the community that gave me a second chance. Relief mingled with concern in Joshua's expression. Are you certain? It's a significant opportunity. Your influence could extend beyond our little corner of the territory. I'm certain. Margaret reached for his hand, her touch familiar and reassuring. 5 years ago, I might have jumped at such an offer, eager to prove my worth, to demonstrate that a woman of my age and background could achieve such prominence. And now? Now I understand that true influence isn't measured by titles or territory. Covered, she replied, watching the lightning illuminate the landscape they both loved. It's measured in lives touched, minds opened, hearts connected. She squeezed his hand. Besides, we're building something important here, you and I. Something that matters more than any appointment. The wisdom in her words struck Joshua anew. This perspective that valued depth over breadth, quality of impact over quantity. It was precisely this insight, born of her years and experiences, that had first drawn him to her after he'd moved past his initial foolish dismissal. You've never regretted it? He asked, the question emerging from some last vestige of uncertainty. Marrying a frontier rancher instead of returning to civilization? Taking on a ready-made family instead of pursuing your own ambitions? Margaret's laugh held genuine amusement. What a curious question after 5 years. She turned to face him fully. My ambitions weren't left behind, Joshua. They were fulfilled in ways I never anticipated. I wanted purpose, connection, the chance to make a difference. I found all 3 here in abundance. The conversation might have continued, but they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, unusual at this late hour. Joshua rose, instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle kept by the door. Kent Place, called a voice from the darkness. Got an urgent telegram for Mrs. Margaret Kent. Joshua relaxed slightly, recognizing young Tim Thompson from the telegraph office. Come ahead, Tim. We're on the porch. The boy, now 16 and working afternoons at the telegraph office to fund his college aspirations, rode into the yard and dismounted with the easy grace of someone raised on horseback. Evening, Mr. Kent, Mrs. Kent. Sorry to disturb you so late, but this came marked urgent. He handed Margaret a folded paper. Operator said it came all the way from Boston. Margaret accepted the telegram with a slight frown. Her connections to Boston had dwindled over the years. Occasional correspondence with Harriet, Christmas cards from former colleagues, nothing that would warrant an urgent telegram. Thank you, Tim, Joshua said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. Can I offer you coffee before you ride back? No, sir, thank you. Got 3 more deliveries before I can call it a night. The boy tipped his hat respectfully and remounted, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had arrived. Margaret unfolded the telegram, moving closer to the porch lamp to read the brief message. Joshua watched her face, noting the slight widening of her eyes, the parting of her lips in surprise. What is it? He asked when she remained silent. Harriet's brother has died, Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the evident shock. William Blackwood, my cousin. Apparently he left no direct heirs. She looked up, her expression dazed. He's left the entire Blackwood estate to me. Joshua took the telegram, scanning its terse contents. Your father's house? The school property? All of it. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. William and I barely knew each other. He left Boston for California years ago. I had no idea he even owned the family property. How much are we talking about? Is it substantial? Very. Margaret sank back into her chair. The Blackwood Academy property alone is worth a small fortune, especially now that Boston has expanded eastward, and the family home. She trailed off, memories visibly washing over her. Joshua watched emotions play across her face. Shock, confusion, a hint of what might have been wistfulness. An unexpected inheritance would change anyone's calculations. A substantial fortune. Even more so. "You'll need to go to Boston," he said finally, the words difficult but necessary. "Sort out the legal matters. See the property for yourself before making any decisions." Margaret looked up sharply. "Decisions? About what you want to do with it? Sell? Retain ownership from a distance? Perhaps." He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. "Perhaps return, at least for a time. Revive the school your father founded." The possibility hung between them, unspoken until this moment, but suddenly vivid. Margaret, restored to her former position in Boston society, running a prestigious girls' academy instead of a frontier school, living in a grand house instead of a ranch, surrounded by culture and convenience instead of wilderness and hardship. "Joshua Kent," Margaret said, her voice taking on the firm tone she typically reserved for unruly students. "Are you suggesting I might abandon our life here because of an inheritance?" "Not suggesting," he clarified, "just acknowledging possibilities. This changes things, Margaret. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise." "Does it?" She set the telegram aside. "Does money change what we've built? Does it alter our family, our community, the work we've invested here? No, but it offers options you didn't have before. Options you might have chosen 5 years ago had they been available." Joshua met her gaze directly. "I want you to consider all possibilities without feeling obligated by our marriage, or Lily, or the school. If part of you has longed for Boston—" "I haven't," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Not once in 5 years." "Even so," Joshua persisted, "this inheritance represents your family legacy. It deserves proper consideration. Margaret studied him, her expression softening as she recognized the mixture of generosity and fear motivating his words. "You're right about one thing," she agreed finally. "I should go to Boston, settle the legal matters, see the property, make informed decisions about its disposition." Relief and apprehension warred in Joshua's chest. "How long would you be gone?" "We," Margaret corrected. "How long would we be gone? I'm not traveling across the country without my family, Joshua." She reached for his hand again. "The school term ends in 3 weeks. We could leave immediately after, spend the summer in Boston, and return before the new term begins." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Unless you're afraid of civilization." The teasing question eased the tension that had built between them. "I managed well enough during the war," Joshua reminded her. "Though I admit the prospect of Boston high society is more intimidating than Confederate artillery. Lily would benefit from seeing the East," Margaret continued, warming to the idea. "The museums, libraries, concerts, experiences she can't have here, at least not yet." "A family adventure, then," Joshua said, relief evident in his voice. "Before Lily gets much older and develops stronger opinions about leaving her friends behind." The plans unfolded rapidly over the following weeks. Margaret arranged for her assistant teachers to conduct summer sessions for those students who needed extra instruction. Joshua delegated ranch responsibilities to his foreman, a capable man who had proven his worth over years of loyal service. Trunks were packed, arrangements made for the long journey east, letters sent ahead to Harriet announcing their impending arrival. Summer had fully blossomed when the Kent family boarded the eastbound train, Lily's excitement barely contained. as she pressed her face against the window, eager to witness the changing landscape. Joshua appeared less comfortable, his tall frame constrained by the passenger car's confines, his expression suggesting he was already counting the days until they could return west. Margaret experienced her own mixture of emotions as the train pulled away from the station. This journey reversed the one she had taken alone 5 years earlier, a journey of desperation and last hopes that had, against all odds, led to profound happiness. Now she returned to Boston not as a destitute spinster, but as a respected educator, a beloved wife and mother, a woman who had found her true purpose far from the city of her birth. The journey east unfolded like a moving panorama of American diversity, the wild Montana landscape giving way to the settled farms of the Midwest, the industrial cities of the Great Lakes, the historic villages of New England. Throughout, Margaret served as guide and interpreter, explaining to Lily the significance of what they witnessed, answering Joshua's pragmatic questions about agriculture and commerce in regions so different from their own. 2 weeks of travel brought them finally to Boston, a city both familiar and strange to Margaret after 5 years' absence. The cobblestone streets, the brick row houses, the cultivated parks and gardens, all appeared smaller somehow, more confined than in her memory. "It's so crowded," Lily whispered, pressing closer to Margaret as they navigated the busy streets, from the train station to the hotel, and noisy, and it smells funny. "You'll adjust," Margaret assured her, though she too found the city's sensory bombardment overwhelming after years of Montana's vast spaces and clean air. Harriet met them at the hotel, embracing Margaret with genuine joy. "I hardly recognized you," she exclaimed, stepping back to study her friend. "You look so vital. The West obviously agrees with you." "It does," Margaret confirmed, making introductions. "This is my husband, Joshua, and our daughter, Lily." Harriet's eyes widened slightly at "our daughter," a small tell that revealed her continuing adjustment to Margaret's new life. In their correspondence, Margaret had always referred to Lily as her stepdaughter, maintaining technical accuracy while perhaps understating the emotional bond that had formed. "I've arranged for a carriage tomorrow to take you to the Blackwood property," Harriet explained as they settled in the hotel parlor. "The solicitor will meet us there with the keys and paperwork." "Has anything been done with the academy building since my father's death?" Margaret asked, curious about the property that had once been the center of her life. "It's been closed up," Harriet replied. "William never showed any interest in reopening the school. The family home has been maintained by a caretaker, but no one has lived there for years." The information stirred mixed emotions in Margaret. The school had been her father's legacy, and briefly hers, before financial difficulties forced its closure. To know it had stood empty all these years seemed both a waste and a reprieve. At least it hadn't been transformed beyond recognition or repurposed in ways her father would have abhorred. "We'll see everything tomorrow," Joshua said, noting her pensive expression. "No decisions need to be made immediately." His practical approach anchored her, as it had countless times throughout their marriage. Joshua's ability to reduce complex emotional situations to manageable steps had proven invaluable in navigating life's challenges. The following morning brought them to the imposing brick edifice that had housed the Blackwood Academy for Girls. Margaret stood before it, memories washing over her, students filing through the arched doorway, her father's commanding presence in the main hall, her own years teaching in the bright corner classroom with its tall windows. "It's bigger than our whole school," Lily observed, craning her neck to take in the 3-story structure. "A different kind of education happened here," Margaret explained. "More formal, less practical than what we offer in Cottonwood Springs." The solicitor, a humorless man named Perkins, unlocked the massive front door, releasing the musty scent of disuse. "Everything is as it was left," he informed them, handing Margaret a substantial ring of keys. The furnishings, the educational materials, even the financial records in your father's office. They toured the building slowly, Margaret pointing out significant spaces to Joshua and Lily. The assembly hall, where Friday recitations had been conducted, the science room with its glass-fronted cabinets of specimens, the library with empty shelves that had once held hundreds of volumes. The books, Margaret asked, running her finger through dust on a shelf. Sold to settle debts, Perkins replied matter-of-factly. Along with much of the scientific equipment and musical instruments, the information stung less than Margaret had expected. 5 years had dulled the pain of those desperate final days when her father's dream had crumbled amid mounting debts and dwindling enrollment. From the academy, they proceeded to the Blackwood family home, a handsome federal-style residence, on a tree-lined street in what had once been Boston's outskirts, but was now firmly incorporated into the expanding city. Here the caretaker had maintained a minimum standard of care. Sheets draped the furniture, but the floors gleamed with regular polishing, and the gardens, visible through tall windows, showed evidence of consistent attention. "This was your home?" Lily asked, her voice hushed as she took in the formal parlour with its ornate mouldings and marble fireplace. "From birth until I left for Cottonwood Springs," Margaret confirmed. "My father was born here as well. The Blackwoods have owned this property for 3 generations." Joshua remained largely silent during the tour, his expression revealing little as he observed these physical manifestations of Margaret's former life. Only occasionally did he ask practical questions about the property's condition or potential value. When the solicitor finally departed, leaving them alone in the family home's library, a wood-panelled sanctuary that had been Margaret's favourite retreat, Joshua spoke the question that had hovered unasked throughout the day. "Could you imagine living here again?" Margaret looked around the room at the empty bookshelves that had once held her father's prized collection, the desk where she had graded countless student papers, the window seat where she had read during stolen moments. "Of leisure? No," she said simply, "not anymore." Relief flickered across Joshua's face before he schooled his expression. The academy, then. It could be reopened with proper investment. The inheritance includes substantial funds, according to Perkins. Margaret moved to the window, gazing out. At the garden where she had played as a child, Boston spread beyond, familiar church spires punctuating the skyline, the distant harbour where ships connected the city to the wider world. "I've been thinking about that," she said slowly. "Not about reopening the academy myself, but about its potential purpose." "What do you mean?" Joshua joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Boston has dozens of girls' schools, some better than the Blackwood Academy ever was, some worse, but they all serve essentially the same population, daughters of privilege being prepared for lives of social refinement." She turned to face him. "What if the academy became something different, something more aligned with what we've built in Cottonwood Springs?" Interest sparked in Joshua's eyes. "A school for a different population, a teacher training college." Margaret specified, the idea crystallizing as she spoke, focused specifically on preparing educators for frontier communities. A place where young women and men could learn not just academic subjects, but practical methods for teaching in challenging environments with limited resources. The more she described her vision, the more animated she became. "Think of it, Joshua. Most Eastern teachers arrive in frontier towns utterly unprepared for the realities they face. Multiple age groups in one room, students with spotty previous education, limited books and materials. A dedicated institution could address those challenges directly, sending graduates west with realistic expectations and practical skills." Joshua studied her with growing admiration. "You've given this considerable thought. I've had 5 years of practical experience to inform it." Margaret replied. 5 years of adapting Eastern educational methods to Western realities. Why not formalize that knowledge? Create a pipeline of well-prepared teachers for communities like Cottonwood Springs. You wouldn't run it yourself, Joshua clarified, the critical question still hovering between them. No. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. I would. Help establish it, certainly. Create the curriculum, help recruit suitable faculty, but my home is in Montana, with you, with Lily, with the school and community we've built together. She reached for his hand. This inheritance doesn't change that fundamental truth. The tension Joshua had carried since the telegram's arrival finally dissolved completely. I feared, he admitted quietly, that seeing all this again, the culture, the conveniences, the remnants of your former life, might make you realize what you'd sacrificed by marrying a frontier rancher. Oh, Joshua! Margaret's tone held equal parts exasperation and affection. When will you fully understand? I sacrificed nothing that mattered. I gained everything I truly needed. She led him to the library's comfortable window seat, where they sat together in the late afternoon light. 5 years ago, I was desperate, a spinster with dwindling options and no clear purpose. I answered your advertisement because I saw no other choice. Her smile softened the brutal honesty. Now I'm a wife, a mother, a respected educator building something meaningful. Which life would you choose, if given the option? Joshua's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. When you put it that way, the answer seems obvious. It is obvious, Margaret agreed. At least to me. This inheritance offers opportunities. Certainly, for philanthropy, for expanding educational access, for securing Lily's future, but it doesn't offer happiness. I've already found that in Cottonwood Springs. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lily appeared in the library. Doorway, her exploration of the house apparently complete. It's a nice house, she said, crossing to join them at the window seat, but it doesn't feel like home. No, Margaret agreed, making room for the child between them. Home is where we've built our life together. Can we go back soon? Lily asked, her initial excitement about the East apparently tempered by the reality of its crowded, noisy actuality. I miss my pony, and my friends, and the mountains. Soon, Joshua promised. But first, your mother has some important work to do. Here, setting up something that will help many children and communities in places like Cottonwood Springs. Lily considered this. Like our school, but bigger. In a way, Margaret confirmed, a school for teachers so they can learn how to teach effectively in frontier towns. The concept clearly stretched the limits of Lily's understanding, but she nodded solemnly. That sounds important. It is, Joshua agreed, his eyes meeting Margaret's over their daughter's head. Your mother sees possibilities others miss. It's one of her greatest gifts. The summer unfolded around this central purpose, transforming the Blackwood Academy into a pioneering institution for frontier education. Margaret threw herself into the work with characteristic thoroughness, consulting with educational experts, drafting curriculum plans, interviewing potential faculty members who would carry the vision forward. Joshua supported her efforts with practical assistance and emotional encouragement, while also exposing Lily to Boston's cultural offerings, museums, libraries, concerts, even a memorable sailing excursion in the harbor. Together, they explored Margaret's past, not as a competing alternative to their life in Montana, but as a complementary chapter in their shared story. As August waned and their departure for the West approached, Margaret stood in the Academy's main hall, now humming with contractors making necessary renovations. The Blackwood Teaching College would welcome its first students the following spring. Overseen by a capable director Margaret had personally selected, a former frontier teacher who shared her vision for practical, adaptable education. "Ready to go home?" Joshua asked, finding her lost in contemplation. "More than ready," Margaret confirmed. "This has been a productive summer, but Montana is calling." "The foreman's letters suggest an excellent harvest," Joshua noted. "And your assistant teachers report the summer sessions were well attended." "Life continued without us," Margaret observed, a smile playing at her lips. "Though I hope we were at least somewhat missed." "Undoubtedly," Joshua assured her, offering his arm. "Mrs. Miller threatens dire consequences if we don't return with detailed accounts of Boston society. Apparently, her subscription to Godey's Ladies' Book has intensified her interest in Eastern fashions." Margaret laughed, taking his arm as they walked toward the exit. "We'll have stories enough to last through the winter evenings." Their final night in Boston found them at the Blackwood family home, now cleaned, and prepared for its new role as administrative offices for the teaching college. Lily had already retired, exhausted from farewell visits to new friends made during their summer stay. "Any regrets?" Joshua asked as they stood in the library, the room Margaret had always loved best. "About selling the house? About leaving Boston again?" Margaret considered the question seriously, her gaze traveling over the familiar contours of the room where she had spent so many hours of her former life. "No regrets," she said finally. "Gratitude for what this place gave me, but no desire to reclaim it. My life is elsewhere now." Joshua nodded, understanding without further explanation. After 5 years of marriage, they had developed the shorthand of longtime partners, able to convey complex emotions with minimal words, to read the subtleties in each other's expressions and gestures. "What about you?" Margaret asked. "Any regrets about our Boston summer, about the decisions we've made regarding the inheritance?" "None," Joshua replied without hesitation. "The teaching college honors your father's legacy while addressing a genuine need. The financial arrangements secure Lily's future and the ranch's stability, regardless of Montana's notoriously unpredictable weather and markets." He drew her into his arms, "And I've had the privilege of seeing how thoroughly my remarkable wife has chosen our life together, even when presented with alternatives." Margaret leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength that had become her most reliable comfort. "Not much of a choice, really," she murmured, "between a life of purpose with people I love and a return to the past that failed me once before." "Nevertheless," Joshua said, his lips brushing her temple, "I'm profoundly grateful for your decision." The journey west felt different from their eastward trip. A return rather than an exploration, a homecoming rather than an adventure. As the train carried them across the continent, Margaret watched the landscape transform from settled civilization to open frontier with increasing anticipation. When they finally crossed into Montana territory, Lily could barely contain her excitement, pointing out familiar landmarks as if greeting old friends. The mountains appeared on the horizon, their majestic silhouettes a welcome sight after Boston's flat terrain. "Almost home," Joshua said, his own relief evident in the relaxation of his shoulders, the ease returning to his expression after months, in an environment that, while interesting, had never felt truly comfortable. Cottonwood Springs welcomed them with a town-wide celebration, a testament to the Kent's central place in community life. The school had been freshly painted in preparation for the fall term. The ranch house gleamed with evidence of Mrs. Jenkins' thorough cleaning. Even the weather cooperated, offering a perfect late summer day for their homecoming. That evening, as Lily excitedly recounted their Boston adventures to Mrs. Miller on the porch, Margaret and Joshua stood together at the edge of their property, watching the sun set behind familiar mountains. 5 years ago, Margaret mused, I stepped off the train in Cottonwood Springs with nothing but a valise and wounded pride, certain my life was effectively over at 38. And now, Joshua prompted, though he knew the answer, "Now I understand that life doesn't end at any particular age," Margaret replied, watching the sky transform through shades of gold and crimson. "It only ends when we stop growing, stop learning, stop loving." Joshua's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture so familiar it felt like an extension of her own body. "Wisdom that comes only with years," he observed, echoing words spoken on this same spot years earlier. "Wisdom that comes with experience," Margaret corrected gently, "with mistakes made and lessons learned, with rejection survived and second, chances embraced." As darkness settled over the Montana landscape, stars emerging in the vast sky, with a clarity impossible in Boston's light-polluted atmosphere, Margaret felt the profound rightness of their return. The inheritance had offered options, choices, alternatives, all declined in favor of the life they had built together in this remote corner of the country. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for being too old had found that age was not the liability she had feared, but the very quality that made her life rich and meaningful. The silver in her hair, the lines beside her eyes, the experiences that had shaped her character, these were not flaws to be hidden or apologized for, but assets to be valued. In Joshua's arms, beneath the Montana stars, Margaret Kent knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found not just a home, but her true place in the world. Not despite her years, but because of them. Not in spite of past disappointments, but through them. The rejection that had once seemed devastating had led to the most profound acceptance. The journey undertaken in desperation had delivered her to a destination more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. The life she had feared was ending at 38 had in fact been just beginning. Richer, deeper, and infinitely more meaningful than her younger self could have possibly understood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.